Chapter 41 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Containing fresh discoveries, and showing that surprises, like misfortunes, seldom come alone. Her situation was, indeed, one of no common trial and difficulty. While she felt the most eager and burning desire to penetrate the mystery in which Oliver's history was enveloped, she could not but hold sacred the confidence which the miserable woman with whom she had just conversed had reposed in her as a young and guileless girl. Her words and manner had touched Rose Maylie's heart, and, mingled with her love for her young charge, and scarcely less intense in its truth and fervour, was her fond wish to win the outcast back to repentance and hope. They proposed remaining in London only 3 days, prior to departing for some weeks to a distant part of the coast. It was now midnight of the first day. What course of action could she determine upon which could be adopted in 48 hours, or how could she postpone the journey without exciting suspicion? Mr. Losburn was with them, and would be for the next 2 days. But Rose was too well acquainted with the excellent gentleman's impetuosity, and foresaw too clearly the wrath with which, in the first explosion of his indignation, he would regard the instrument of Oliver's recapture, to trust him with the secret, when her representations on the girl's behalf could be seconded by no experienced person. These were all reasons for the greatest caution and the most circumspect behaviour in communicating it to Mrs. Maylie, whose first impulse would infallibly be to hold a conference with the worthy doctor on the subject. As to resorting to any legal adviser, even if she had known how to do so, it was scarcely to be thought of for the same reason. Once the thought occurred to her of seeking assistance from Harry, but this awakened the recollection of their last parting, and it seemed unworthy of her to call him back when, the tears rose to her eyes as she pursued this train of reflection, he might have by this time learnt to forget her, and to be happier away. Disturbed by these different reflections, inclining now to one course and then to another, and again recoiling from all, as each successive consideration presented itself to her mind, Rose passed a sleepless and anxious night. After more communing with herself next day, she arrived at the desperate conclusion of consulting Harry. "If it be painful to him," she thought, "to come back here, how painful it will be to me! But perhaps he will not come. He may write, or he may come himself, and studiously abstain from meeting me. He did when he went away. I hardly thought he would, but it was better for us both." And here Rose dropped the pen and turned away, as though the very paper which was to be her messenger should not see her weep. She had taken up the same pen and laid it down again 50 times, and had considered and reconsidered the first line of her letter without writing the first word, when Oliver, who had been walking in the streets with Mr. Giles for a bodyguard, entered the room in such breathless haste and violent agitation as seemed to betoken some new cause of alarm. "What makes you look so flurried?" asked Rose, advancing to meet him. "I hardly know how. I feel as if I should be choked," replied the boy. "Oh dear, to think that I should see him at last, and you should be able to know that I have told you the truth." "I never thought you had told us anything but the truth," said Rose, soothing him. "But what is this? Of whom do you speak?" "I have seen the gentleman," replied Oliver, scarcely able to articulate. "The gentleman who was so good to me, Mr. Brownlow, that we have so often talked about." "Where?" asked Rose. "Getting out of a coach," replied Oliver, shedding tears of delight, "and going into a house. I didn't speak to him. I couldn't speak to him, for he didn't see me, and I trembled so that I was not able to go up to him. But Giles asked for me whether he lived there, and they said he did. Look here," said Oliver, opening a scrap of paper. "Here it is. Here is where he lives. I'm going there directly. Oh, dear me, dear me! What shall I do when I come to see him and hear him speak again?" With her attention not a little distracted by these and a great many other incoherent exclamations of joy, Rose read the address, which was Craven Street in the Strand. She very soon determined upon turning the discovery to account. "Quick," she said, "tell them to fetch a hackney coach, and be ready to go with me. I will take you there directly without a minute's loss of time. I will only tell my aunt that we are going out for an hour, and be ready as soon as you are." Oliver needed no prompting to dispatch, and in a little more than 5 minutes they were on the way to Craven Street. When they arrived there, Rose left Oliver in the coach, under pretence of preparing the old gentleman to receive him, and sending up her card by the servant, requested to see Mr. Brownlow on very pressing business. The servant soon returned, to beg that she would walk upstairs, and following him into an upper room, Miss Maylie was presented to an elderly gentleman of benevolent appearance, in a bottle green coat, at no great distance from whom was seated another gentleman in nankeen breeches and gaiters, who did not look particularly benevolent, and who was sitting with his hands clasped on the top of a thick stick, with his chin propped thereupon. "Dear me," said the gentleman in the bottle green coat, hastily rising with great politeness, "I beg your pardon, young lady. I imagined it was some importunate person who—I beg you will excuse me. Be seated, pray." "Mr. Brownlow, I believe, sir," said Rose, glancing from the other gentleman to the one who had spoken. "That is my name," said the old gentleman. "This is my friend, Mr. Grimwig. Grimwig, will you leave us for a few minutes?" "I believe," interposed Miss Maylie, "that at this period of our interview I need not give that gentleman the trouble of going away. If I am correctly informed, he is cognizant of the business on which I wish to speak to you." Mr. Brownlow inclined his head. Mr. Grimwig, who had made one very stiff bow and risen from his chair, made another very stiff bow and dropped into it again. "I shall surprise you very much, I have no doubt," said Rose, naturally embarrassed, "but you once showed great benevolence and goodness to a very dear young friend of mine, and I am sure you will take an interest in hearing of him again." "Indeed," said Mr. Brownlow. "Oliver Twist, as you knew him," replied Rose. The words no sooner escaped her lips than Mr. Grimwig, who had been affecting to dip into a large book that lay on the table, upset it with a great crash, and falling back in his chair, discharged from his features every expression but one of unmitigated wonder, and indulged in a prolonged and vacant stare. Then, as if ashamed of having betrayed so much emotion, he jerked himself, as it were, by a convulsion into his former attitude, and looking out straight before him, emitted a long deep whistle, which seemed at last not to be discharged on empty air, but to die away in the innermost recesses of his stomach. Mr. Brownlow was no less surprised, although his astonishment was not expressed in the same eccentric manner. He drew his chair nearer to Miss Maylie's, and said, "Do me the favour, my dear young lady, to leave entirely out of the question that goodness and benevolence of which you speak, and of which nobody else knows anything; and if you have it in your power to produce any evidence which will alter the unfavourable opinion I was once induced to entertain of that poor child, in heaven's name put me in possession of it." "A bad one! I'll eat my head if he's not a bad one," growled Mr. Grimwig, speaking by some ventriloquial power without moving a muscle of his face. "He is a child of a noble nature and a warm heart," said Rose, colouring, "and that power which has thought fit to try him beyond his years has planted in his breast affections and feelings which would do honour to many who have numbered his days 6 times over." "I'm only 61," said Mr. Grimwig, with the same rigid face, "and as the devil is in it if this Oliver is not 12 years old at least, I don't see the application of that remark." "Do not heed my friend, Miss Maylie," said Mr. Brownlow. "He does not mean what he says." "Yes, he does," growled Mr. Grimwig. "No, he does not," said Mr. Brownlow, obviously rising in wrath as he spoke. "He'll eat his head if he doesn't," growled Mr. Grimwig. "He would deserve to have it knocked off if he does," said Mr. Brownlow. "And he'd uncommonly like to see any man offer to do it," responded Mr. Grimwig, knocking his stick upon the floor. Having gone thus far, the two old gentlemen severally took snuff, and afterwards shook hands according to their invariable custom. "Now, Miss Maylie," said Mr. Brownlow, "to return to the subject in which your humanity is so much interested, will you let me know what intelligence you have of this poor child, allowing me to promise that I exhausted every means in my power of discovering him, and that since I have been absent from this country, my first impression that he had imposed upon me, and had been persuaded by his former associates to rob me, has been considerably shaken." Rose, who had had time to collect her thoughts, at once related, in a few natural words, all that had befallen Oliver since he left Mr. Brownlow's house, reserving Nancy's information for that gentleman's private ear, and concluding with the assurance that his only sorrow for some months past had not been able to meet with his former benefactor and friend. "Thank God!" said the old gentleman. "This is great happiness to me, great happiness. But you have not told me where he is now, Miss Maylie. You must pardon my finding fault with you, but why have you not brought him?" "He is waiting in the coach at the door," replied Rose. "At the door!" cried the old gentleman, with which he hurried out of the room, down the stairs, up the coach steps, and into the coach, without another word. When the room door closed behind him, Mr. Grimwig lifted up his head, and converting one of the hind legs of his chair into a pivot, described 3 distinct circles with the assistance of his stick and the table, sitting in it all the time. After performing this evolution, he rose and limped as fast as he could up and down the room at least a dozen times, and then, stopping suddenly before Rose, kissed her without the slightest preface. "Hush!" he said, as the young lady rose in some alarm at this unusual proceeding. "Don't be afraid. I'm old enough to be your grandfather. You're a sweet girl. I like you. Here they are." In fact, as he threw himself at one dexterous dive into his former seat, Mr. Brownlow returned, accompanied by Oliver, whom Mr. Grimwig received very graciously; and if the gratification of that moment had been the only reward for all her anxiety and care in Oliver's behalf, Rose Maylie would have been well repaid. "There is somebody else who should not be forgotten, by the by," said Mr. Brownlow, ringing the bell. "Send Mrs. Bedwin here, if you please." The old housekeeper answered the summons with all despatch, and dropping a curtsy at the door, waited for orders. "Why, you get blinder every day, Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow, rather testily. "Well, that I do, sir," replied the old lady. "People's eyes at my time of life don't improve with age, sir." "I could have told you that," rejoined Mr. Brownlow. "But put on your glasses, and see if you can't find out what you are wanted for, will you?" The old lady began to rummage in her pocket for her spectacles, but Oliver's patience was not proof against this new trial, and yielding to his first impulse, he sprang into her arms. "God be good to me!" cried the old lady, embracing him. "It is my innocent boy!" "My dear old nurse!" cried Oliver. "He would come back, I knew he would," said the old lady, holding him in her arms. "How well he looks, and how like a gentleman's son he is dressed again! Where have you been this long, long while? Ah, the same sweet face, but not so pale; the same soft eye, but not so sad. I have never forgotten them or his quiet smile, but have seen them every day, side by side with those of my own dear children, dead and gone since I was a lightsome young creature." Running on thus, and now holding Oliver from her to mark how he had grown, now clasping him to her and passing her fingers fondly through his hair, the good soul laughed and wept upon his neck by turns. Leaving her and Oliver to compare notes at leisure, Mr. Brownlow led the way into another room, and there he heard from Rose a full narration of the interview with Nancy, which occasioned him no little surprise and perplexity. Rose also explained her reasons for not confiding in her friend Mr. Losberne in the first instance. The old gentleman considered that she had acted prudently, and readily undertook to hold solemn conference with the worthy doctor himself. To afford him an early opportunity for the execution of this design, it was arranged that he should call at the hotel at 8 o'clock that evening, and that in the meantime Mrs. Maylie should be cautiously informed of all that had occurred. These preliminaries adjusted, Rose and Oliver returned home. Rose had by no means overrated the measure of the good doctor's wrath. Nancy's history was no sooner unfolded to him than he poured forth a shower of mingled threats and execrations, threatened to make her the first victim of the combined ingenuity of Messrs. Blathers and Duff, and actually put on his hat preparatory to sallying forth to obtain the assistance of those worthies; and doubtless he would, in his first outbreak, have carried the intention into effect without a moment's consideration of the consequences, if he had not been restrained in part by corresponding violence on the side of Mr. Brownlow, who was himself of an irascible temperament, and partly by such arguments and representations as seemed best calculated to dissuade him from his hot-brained purpose. "Then what the devil is to be done?" said the impetuous doctor, when they had rejoined the two ladies. "Are we to pass a vote of thanks to all these vagabonds, male and female, and beg them to accept £100 or so apiece as a trifling mark of our esteem, and some slight acknowledgment of their kindness to Oliver?" "Not exactly that," rejoined Mr. Brownlow, laughing; "but we must proceed gently and with great care." "Gentleness and care!" exclaimed the doctor. "I'd send them one and all to—" "Never mind where," interposed Mr. Brownlow, "but reflect whether sending them anywhere is likely to attain the object we have in view." "What object?" asked the doctor. "Simply the discovery of Oliver's parentage, and regaining for him the inheritance of which, if this story be true, he has been fraudulently deprived." "Ah," said Mr. Losberne, cooling himself with his pocket-handkerchief, "I almost forgot that." "You see," pursued Mr. Brownlow, Placing this poor girl entirely out of the question, and supposing it were possible to bring these scoundrels to justice without compromising her safety, what good should we bring about? Hanging a few of them at least in all probability, suggested the doctor, and transporting the rest. Very good, replied Mr. Brownlow, smiling. But no doubt they will bring that about for themselves in the fulness of time, and if we step in to forestall them, it seems to me that we shall be performing a very quixotic act, in direct opposition to our own interest, or at least to Oliver's, which is the same thing. How? inquired the doctor. Thus. It is quite clear that we shall have extreme difficulty in getting to the bottom of this mystery unless we can bring this man, Monks, upon his knees. That can only be done by stratagem, and by catching him when he is not surrounded by these people. For suppose if he were apprehended, we have no proof against him. He is not even, so far as we know, or as the facts appear to us, concerned with the gang in any of their robberies. If he were not discharged, it is very unlikely that he could receive any further punishment than being committed to prison as a rogue and vagabond, and of course ever afterwards his mouth would be so obstinately closed that he might as well, for our purposes, be deaf, dumb, blind, and an idiot. Then, said the doctor impetuously, I put it to you again, whether you think it reasonable that this promise to the girl should be considered binding? A promise made with the best and kindest intentions, but really— "Do not discuss the point, my dear young lady, pray," said Mr. Brownlow, interrupting Rose as she was about to speak. "The promise shall be kept. I don't think it will, in the slightest degree, interfere with our proceedings. But before we can resolve upon any precise course of action, it will be necessary to see the girl, to ascertain from her whether she will point out this Monks, on the understanding that he is to be dealt with by us, and not by the law; or, if she will not, or cannot do that, to procure from her such an account of his haunts and description of his person as will enable us to identify him. She cannot be seen until next Sunday night. This is Tuesday. I would suggest that in the meantime we remain perfectly quiet, and keep these matters secret even from Oliver himself." Although Mr. Losburn received with many wry faces a proposal involving a delay of 5 whole days, he was fain to admit that no better course occurred to him just then; and as both Rose and Mrs. Maylie sided very strongly with Mr. Brownlow, that gentleman's proposition was carried unanimously. "I should like," he said, "to call in the aid of my friend Grimwig. He is a strange creature, but a shrewd one, and might prove of material assistance to us. I should say that he was bred a lawyer, and quitted the bar in disgust because he had only one brief and a motion of court in 20 years, though whether that is recommendation or not, you must determine for yourselves." "I have no objection to your calling in your friend, if I may call in mine," said the doctor. "We must put it to the vote," replied Mr. Brownlow. "Who may he be?" "That lady's son, and this young lady's very old friend," said the doctor, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie, and concluding with an expressive glance at her niece. Rose blushed deeply, but she did not make any audible objection to this motion. Possibly she felt in a hopeless minority, and Harry Maylie and Mr. Grimwig were accordingly added to the committee. "We stay in town, of course," said Mrs. Maylie, "while there remains the slightest prospect of prosecuting this inquiry with a chance of success. I will spare neither trouble nor expense in behalf of the object in which we are all so deeply interested, and I am content to remain here, if it be for 12 months, so long as you assure me that any hope remains." "Good," rejoined Mr. Brownlow; "and as I see on the faces about me a disposition to inquire how it happened that I was not in the way to corroborate Oliver's tale, and had so suddenly left the kingdom, let me stipulate that I shall be asked no questions until such time as I may deem it expedient to forestall them by telling my own story. Believe me, I make this request with good reason, for I might otherwise excite hopes destined never to be realized, and only increase difficulties and disappointments already quite numerous enough. Come, supper has been announced, and young Oliver, who's all alone in the next room, will have begun to think by this time that we have wearied of his company, and entered into some dark conspiracy to thrust him forth upon the world." With these words the old gentleman gave his hand to Mrs. Maylie, and escorted her into the supper-room. Mr. Losburn followed, leading Rose, and the council was, for the present, effectually broken up. Chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. An old acquaintance of Oliver's, exhibiting decided marks of genius, becomes a public character in the metropolis. Upon the night when Nancy, having lulled Mr. Sikes to sleep, hurried on her self-imposed mission to Rose Maylie, there advanced towards London by the Great North Road two persons upon whom it is expedient that this history should bestow some attention. They were a man and woman, or perhaps they would be better described as a male and female, for the former was one of those long-limbed, knock-kneed, shambling, bony people to whom it is difficult to assign any precise age, looking as they do when they are yet boys like undergrown men, and when they are almost men like overgrown boys. The woman was young, but of a robust and hardy make, as she need have been to bear the weight of the heavy bundle which was strapped to her back. Her companion was not encumbered with much luggage, as there merely dangled from a stick which he carried over his shoulder a small parcel, wrapped in a common handkerchief, and apparently light enough. This circumstance, added to the length of his legs, which were of unusual extent, enabled him with much ease to keep some half-dozen paces in advance of his companion, to whom he occasionally turned with an impatient jerk of the head, as if reproaching her tardiness, and urging her to greater exertion. Thus they had toiled along the dusty road, taking little heed of any object within sight, save when they stepped aside to allow a wider passage for the mail coaches which were whirling out of town, until they passed through Highgate Archway, when the foremost traveller stopped and called impatiently to his companion. "Come on, can't you? What a lazy bones you are, Charlotte!" "It's a heavy load, I can tell you," said the female, coming up almost breathless with fatigue. "Heavy? What are you talking about? What are you made for?" rejoined the male traveller, changing his own little bundle as he spoke to the other's shoulder. "Oh, there you are, resting again. Well, if you ain't enough to tire anybody's patience out, I don't know what is." "Is it much farther?" asked the woman, resting herself against the bank, and looking up with the perspiration streaming from her face. "Much further? You're as good as there," said the long-legged tramper, pointing out before him. "Look there. Those are the lights of London." "They're a good 2 mile off, at least," said the woman, despondingly. "Never mind whether they're 2 mile off, or 20," said Noah Claypole, for it was he. "But get up and come on, or I'll kick you, and so I give you notice." As Noah's nose grew redder with anger, and as he crossed the road while speaking as if fully prepared to put his threat into execution, the woman rose without any further remark, and trudged onward by his side. "Where do you mean to stop for the night, Noah?" she asked, after they had walked a few hundred yards. "How should I know?" replied Noah, whose temper had been considerably impaired by walking. "Near, I hope," said Charlotte. "No, not near," replied Mr. Claypole. "There, not near, so don't think it." "Why not?" "When I tell you that I don't mean to do a thing, that's enough, without any why or because either," replied Mr. Claypole with dignity. "Well, you needn't be so cross," said his companion. "A pretty thing it would be, wouldn't it, to go and stop at the very first public house outside the town, so that Sowerberry, if he came up after us, might poke in his old nose, and have us taken back in a cart with handcuffs on," said Mr. Claypole in a jeering tone. "No, I shall go and lose myself among the narrowest streets I can find, and not stop till we come to the very out-of-the-wayest house I can set eyes on. God, you may thank your stars I've got a head. For if you hadn't gone at first the wrong road o' purpose, and come back across country, you'd have been locked up hard and fast a week ago, my lady, and served you right for being a fool." "I know I ain't as cunning as you are," replied Charlotte, "but don't put all the blame on me, and say I should have been locked up. You would have been if I had been, anyway." "You took the money from the till, you know you did," said Mr. Claypole. "I took it for you, Noah dear," rejoined Charlotte. "Did I keep it?" asked Mr. Claypole. "No, you trusted in me, and let me carry it like a dear, and so you are," said the lady, chucking him under the chin, and drawing her arm through his. This was indeed the case, but as it was not Mr. Claypole's habit to repose a blind and foolish confidence in anybody, it should be observed in justice to that gentleman that he had trusted Charlotte to this extent in order that, if they were pursued, the money might be found on her, which would leave him an opportunity of asserting his innocence of any theft, and would greatly facilitate his chances of escape. Of course he entered at this juncture into no explanation of his motives, and they walked on very lovingly together. In pursuance of this cautious plan, Mr. Claypole went on without halting until he arrived at the Angel at Islington, where he wisely judged, from the crowd of passengers and numbers of vehicles, that London began in earnest. Just pausing to observe which appeared the most crowded streets, and consequently the most to be avoided, he crossed into St. John's Road, and was soon deep in the obscurity of the intricate and dirty ways which, lying between Gray's Inn Lane and Smithfield, render that part of the town one of the lowest and worst that improvement has left in the midst of London. Through these streets Noah Claypole walked, dragging Charlotte after him, now stepping into the kennel to embrace at a glance the whole external character of some small public house, now jogging on again as some fancied appearance induced him to believe it too public for his purpose. At length he stopped in front of one, more humble in appearance and more dirty than any he had yet seen, and having crossed over and surveyed it from the opposite pavement, graciously announced his intention of putting up there for the night. "So give us the bundle," said Noah, unstrapping it from the woman's shoulders and slinging it over his own, "and don't you speak, except when you're spoke to. What's the name of the house? T-H-R... 3 what?" "Cripples," said Charlotte. "3 Cripples," repeated Noah. "A very good sign too. Now then, keep close at my heels and come along." With these injunctions he pushed the rattling door with his shoulder and entered the house, followed by his companion. There was nobody in the bar but a young Jew, who, with his 2 elbows on the counter, was reading a dirty newspaper. He stared very hard at Noah, and Noah stared very hard at him. If Noah had been attired in his charity boy's dress, there might have been some reason for the Jew opening his eyes so wide; but as he had discarded the coat and badge, and wore a short smock frock over his leathers, there seemed no particular reason for his appearance exciting so much attention in a public house. "Is this the 3 Cripples?" asked Noah. "That's the name of this house," replied the Jew. "A gentleman we met on the road coming up from the country recommended us here," said Noah, nudging Charlotte, perhaps to call her attention to this most ingenious device for attracting respect, and perhaps to warn her to betray no surprise. "We want to sleep here to-night." "I'm not certain you can," said Barney, who was the attendant sprite, "but I'll inquire." "Show us the tap, and give us a bit of cold meat and a drop of beer while you're inquiring, will you?" said Noah. Barney complied by ushering them into a small back room, and setting the required viands before them, having done which he informed the travellers that they could be lodged that night, and left the amiable couple to their refreshment. Now this back room was immediately behind the bar, and some steps lower, so that any person connected with the house, undrawing a small curtain which concealed a single pane of glass, fixed in the wall of the last-named apartment, about 5 feet from its flooring, could not only look down upon any guests in the back room without any great hazard of being observed, the glass being in a dark angle of the wall, between which and a large upright beam the observer had to thrust himself, but could, by applying his ear to the partition, ascertain with tolerable distinctness their subject of conversation. The landlord of the house had not withdrawn his eye from this place of espial for 5 minutes, and Barney had only just returned from making the communication above related, when Fagin, in the course of his evening's business, came into the bar to inquire after some of his young pupils. "Hush," said Barney. "Strangers in the next room." "Strangers?" repeated the old man in a whisper. "Ah, and Rubbards too," added Barney, "from the country, but something in your way, or I'm mistaked." Fagin appeared to receive this communication with great interest. Mounting a stool, he cautiously applied his eye to the pane of glass, from which secret post he could see Mr. Claypole taking cold beef from the dish, and porter from the pot, and administering homeopathic doses of both to Charlotte, who sat patiently by, eating and drinking at his pleasure. "Aha!" he whispered, looking round to Barney. "I like that fellow's looks. He'd be of use to us. He knows how to train the girl already. Don't make as much noise as a mouse, my dear, and let me hear him talk. Let me hear him." He again applied his eye to the glass, and turning his ear to the partition, listened attentively, with a subtle and eager look upon his face that might have appertained to some old goblin. "So I mean to be a gentleman," said Mr. Claypole, kicking out his legs and continuing a conversation, the commencement of which Fagin had arrived too late to hear. "No more jolly old coffin, Charlotte, but a gentleman's life for me, and if you like, you should be a lady."
"I should like that well enough, dear," replied Charlotte, "but tills ain't to be emptied every day, and people to get clear off after it."
"Tills be blowed," said Mr. Claypole. "There's more things beside tills to be emptied."
"What do you mean?"
asked his companion.
"Pockets, women's ridicules, houses, mail coaches, banks," said Mr. Claypole, rising with the porter. "But you can't do all that, dear," said Charlotte. "I shall look out to get into company with them as can," replied Noah. "They'll be able to make us useful some way or another. Why, you yourself are worth 50 women. I never see such a precious sly and deceitful creature as you can be when I let you." "Law, how nice it is to hear you say so!" exclaimed Charlotte, imprinting a kiss upon his ugly face. "There, that'll do. Don't you be too affectionate in case I'm cross with you," said Noah, disengaging himself with great gravity. "I should like to be the captain of some band, and have the whooping of 'em and following 'em about, unbeknowns to them. That would suit me, if there was good profit, and if we could only get in with some gentlemen of this sort. I say it would be cheap at that £20 note you've got, especially as we don't very well know how to get rid of it ourselves."
After expressing this opinion, Mr. Claypole looked into the porter-pot with an aspect of deep wisdom, and having well shaken its contents, nodded condescendingly to Charlotte, and took a draught, wherewith he appeared greatly refreshed. He was meditating another when the sudden opening of the door and the appearance of a stranger interrupted him. The stranger was Mr. Fagin, and very amiable he looked, and a very low bow he made as he advanced, and setting himself down at the nearest table, ordered something to drink from the grinning Barney.
"A pleasant night, sir, but cool for the time of year," said Fagin, rubbing his hands. "From the country, I see, sir."
"How do you see that?" asked Noah Claypole.
"We have not so much dust as that in London," replied
Fagin, pointing from Noah's shoes to those of his companion, and from them to the two bundles.
"You're a sharp fella," said Noah. "Only hear that, Charlotte." "Why, one need be sharp in this town, my dear," replied the Jew, sinking his voice into a confidential whisper, "and that's the truth."
Fagin followed up this remark by striking the side of his nose with his right forefinger, a gesture which Noah attempted to imitate, though not with complete success, in consequence of his own nose not being large enough for the purpose. However, Mr. Fagin seemed to interpret the endeavour as expressing a perfect coincidence with his opinion, and put about the liquor which Barney reappeared with in a very friendly manner.
"Good stuff, that,"
observed Mr. Claypole, smacking his lips.
"Dear," said
Fagin,
"a man need be always emptying a till, or pocket, or a woman's reticule, or a house, or a mail coach, or a bank, if he drinks it regularly."
Mr. Claypole no sooner heard this extract from his own remarks than he fell back in his chair and looked from the Jew to Charlotte with a countenance of ashy paleness and excessive terror.
"Don't mind me, my dear," said Fagin, drawing his chair close. "How lucky it was only me that heard you by chance. It was very lucky it was only me."
"I didn't take it," stammered Noah, no longer stretching out his legs like an independent gentleman, but coiling them up as well as he could under his chair.
"It was all her doing. You've got it now, Charlotte, you know you have." "No matter who's got it, or who did it, my dear,"
replied Fagin, glancing nevertheless with a hawk's eye at the girl and at the two bundles.
"I'm in that way myself, and I like you for it."
"In what way?" asked Mr. Claypole, a little recovering.
"In that way of business," rejoined Fagin, "and so are the people of the house. You've hit the right nail upon the head, and you're as safe here as you could be. There is not a safer place in all this town than is the Cripples, that is, when I like to make it so. And I have taken a fancy to you and the young woman. So I've said the word, and you may make your minds easy."
Noah Claypole's mind might have been at ease after this assurance, but his body certainly was not, for he shuffled and writhed about into various uncouth positions, eyeing his new friend meanwhile with mingled fear and suspicion.
"I'll tell you more,"
said Fagin, after he had reassured the girl by dint of friendly nods and muttered encouragements.
"I have got a friend that I think can gratify your darling wish, and put you in the right way, where you can take whatever department of the business you think will suit you best at first, and be taught all the others." "You speak as if you were in earnest," replied Noah. "What advantage would it be to me to be anything else?" inquired Fagin, shrugging his shoulders. "Here, let me have a word with you outside." "There's no occasion to trouble ourselves to move," said Noah, getting his legs by gradual degrees abroad again. "She'll take the luggage upstairs the while. Charlotte, see to them bundles." This mandate, which had been delivered with great majesty, was obeyed without the slightest demur, and Charlotte made the best of her way off with the packages, while Noah held the door open and watched her out. "She's kept tolerably well under, ain't she?" he asked, as he resumed his seat, in the tone of a keeper who had tamed some wild animal. "Quite perfect," rejoined Fagin, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're a genius, my dear." "Why, I suppose if I wasn't I shouldn't be here," replied Noah. "But I say, she'll be back if you lose time." "Now, what do you think," said Fagin, "if you was to like my friend, could you do better than join him?" "Is he in a good way of business? That's where it is," responded Noah, winking one of his little eyes. "The top of the tree, employs a power of hands, has the very best society in the profession." "Regular town maiders?" asked Mr. Claypole. "Not a countryman among 'em, and I don't think he'd take you even on my recommendation if he didn't run rather short of assistants just now," replied Fagin. "Should I have to hand over?" said Noah, slapping his breeches pocket. "It couldn't possibly be done without," replied Fagin, in a most decided manner. "£20, though? It's a lot of money." "Not when it's in a note you can't get rid of," retorted Fagin. "Number and date taken, I suppose? Payment stopped at the bank? Ah, it's not worth much to him. It'll have to go abroad, and he couldn't sell it for a great deal in the market." "When could I see him?" asked Noah doubtfully. "To-morrow morning." "Where?" "Here." Said Noah. "What's the wages?" "Live like a gentleman, board and lodgings, pipes and spirits free, half of all you earn, and half of all the young woman earns," replied Mr. Fagin.
Whether Noah Claypole, whose rapacity was none of the least comprehensive, would have acceded even to these glowing terms had he been a perfectly free agent, is very doubtful. But as he recollected that, in the event of his refusal, it was in the power of his new acquaintance to give him up to justice immediately, and more unlikely things had come to pass, he gradually relented, and said that he thought that would suit him. "But you see," observed Noah, "as she'll be able to do a good deal, I should like to take something very light." "A little fancy work?" suggested Fagin. "Ah, something of that sort," replied Noah. "What do you think would suit me now? Something not too trying for my strength, and not very dangerous, you know. That's the sort of thing." "I heard you talk of something in the spy way upon the others, my dear," said Fagin. "My friend wants somebody who could do that well, very much." "Why, I did mention that, and I shouldn't mind turning my hand to it sometimes," rejoined Mr. Claypole slowly. "But it wouldn't pay by itself, you know." "That's true," observed the Jew, ruminating, or pretending to ruminate. "No, it might not." "What do you think, then?" asked Noah, anxiously regarding him. "Something in a sneaking way, where it was pretty sure work, and not much more risk than being at home?" "What do you think of the old ladies?" asked Fagin. "There's a good deal of money made in snatching their bags and parcels, and running round the corner." "Don't they holler out a good deal, and scratch sometimes?" asked Noah, shaking his head. "I don't think that would answer my purpose. Ain't there any other line open?" "Stop!" said Fagin, laying his hand on Noah's knee. "The kitchen lay." "What's that?" demanded Mr. Claypole. "The kitchen lay, my dear," said Fagin, "is the young children that's sent on errands by their mothers, with sixpences and shillings, and the lay is just to take their money away. They've always got it ready in their hands, then knock 'em into the kennel and walk off very slow, as if there were nothing else the matter but a child fallen down and hurt itself." "Ha, ha, ha!" roared Mr. Claypole, kicking up his legs in ecstasy. "Lord, that's the very thing." "To be sure it is," replied Fagin. "And you can have a few good beats chalked out in Camden Town and Battle Bridge, and neighbourhoods like that, with it always going errands. And you can upset as many kitchens as you want any hour in the day. Ha, 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 ha!
With this Fagin poked Mr. Claypole in the side, and they joined in a burst of laughter both long and loud. "Well, that's all right," said Noah, when he had recovered himself and Charlotte had returned. "What time to-morrow shall we say?" "Will 10 do?" asked Fagin, adding, as Mr. Claypole nodded assent, "What name shall I tell my good friend?" "Mr. Bolter," replied Noah, who had prepared himself for such emergency. "Mr. Maurice Bolter. This is Mrs. Bolter." "Mrs. Bolter's humble servant," said Fagin, bowing with grotesque politeness. "I hope I shall know her better very shortly." "Do you hear the gentleman, Charlotte?" thundered Mr. Claypole. "Yes, Noah, dear," replied Mrs. Bolter, extending her hand. "She calls me Noah as a sort of fond way of talking," said Mr. Maurice Bolter, late Claypole, turning to Fagin. "You understand?" "Oh, yes, I understand perfectly," replied Fagin, telling the truth for once. "Good night, good night." With many adieus and good wishes Mr. Fagin went his way. Noah Claypole, bespeaking his good lady's attention, proceeded to enlighten her relative to the arrangements he had made, with all that haughtiness and air of superiority becoming, not only to a member of the sterner sex, but a gentleman who appreciated the dignity of a special appointment on the kitchen lay, in London and its vicinity. Chapter 43 of Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Wherein is shown how the Artful Dodger got into trouble. "And so it was you that was your own friend, was it?" asked Mr. Claypole, otherwise Bolter, when, by virtue of the compact entered into between them, he had removed next day to Fagin's house. "God, I thought as much last night." "Every man's his own friend, my dear," replied Fagin, with his most insinuating grin. "He hasn't as good a one as himself anywhere." "Except sometimes," replied Maurice Bolter, assuming the air of a man of the world. "Some people are nobody's enemies but their own, you know." "Don't believe that," said Fagin. "When a man's his own enemy, it's only because he's too much his own friend, not because he's careful for everybody but himself. Puh, puh! There ain't such a thing in nature." "There oughtn't to be, if there is," replied Mr. Bolter. "That stands to reason. Some conjurers say that number 3 is the magic number, and some say number 7. It's neither, my friend, neither. It's number 1. "Ha ha!" cried Mr. Bolter. "Number 1 for ever?" "In a little community like ours, my dear," said Fagin, who felt it necessary to qualify this position, "we have a general number 1. That is, you can't consider yourself as number 1 without considering me as the same, and all the other young people." "Oh, the devil!" exclaimed Mr. Bolter. "You see," pursued Fagin, affecting to disregard this interruption, "we are so mixed up together, and identified in our interests, that it must be so. For instance, it is your object to take care of number 1, meaning yourself." "Certainly," replied Mr. Bolter. "You're about right there." "Well, you can't take care of yourself, number 1, without taking care of me, number 1. "Number 2, you mean?" replied Mr. Bolter, who was largely endowed with the quality of selfishness. "No, I don't," retorted Fagin. "I'm of the same importance to you as you are to yourself." "Don't say," interrupted Mr. Bolter. "You're a very nice man, and I'm very fond of you, but we ain't quite so fit together as all that comes to." "Only think," said Fagin, shrugging his shoulders and stretching out his hands. "Only consider. You've done what's a very pretty thing, and what I love you for doing, but what at the same time would put the cravat about your throat, that's so very easily tied, and so very difficult to unloose. In plain English, the halter." Mr. Bolter put his hand to his neckerchief, as if he felt it inconveniently tight, and murmured an assent, qualified in tone but not in substance. "The gallows," continued Fagin, "the gallows, my dear, is an ugly finger-post, which points out a very short and sharp turning, that has stopped many a bold fellow's career in the broad highway. To keep in the easy road, and keep it at a distance, is object number 1 with you." "Of course it is," replied Mr. Bolter. "What do you talk about such things for?" "Only to show you my meaning clearly," said the Jew, raising his eyebrows. "To be able to do that you depend upon me. To keep my little business all snug, I depend on you. The first is your number one, the second my number one. The more you value your number one, the more careful you must be of mine. So we come at last to what I told you at first, that a regard for number one holds us all together, and must do so unless we would all go to pieces in company. That's true, rejoined Mr. Bolter thoughtfully. Oh, you're a cunning old codger. Mr. Fagin saw with delight that this tribute to his power was no mere compliment, but that he had really impressed his recruit with a sense of his wily genius, which it was most important that he should entertain in the outset of their acquaintance. To strengthen an impression so desirable and useful, he followed up the blow by acquainting him in some detail with the magnitude and extent of his operations, blending truth and fiction together as best served his purpose, and bringing both to bear with so much art that Mr. Bolter's respect visibly increased, and became tempered at the same time with a degree of wholesome fear, which it was highly desirable to awaken. "It's this mutual trust that we have in each other that consoles me under heavy losses," said Fagin. "My best hand was taken from me yesterday morning." "You don't mean to say he died?" cried Mr. Bolter. "No, no," replied Fagin. "Not so bad as that. Not quite so bad." "What? I suppose he was—" "Wanted," interposed Fagin. "Yes, he was wanted." "Very particular?" inquired Mr. Bolter. "No," replied Fagin, "not very. He was charged with attempting to pick a pocket, and they found a silver snuff-box on him. His own, my dear, his own, for he took snuff himself, and was very fond of it. They remanded him till to-day, for they thought they knew the owner. Ah, he was worth 50 boxes, and I'd give the price of as many to have him back. You should have known the dodger, my dear. You should have known the dodger." "Well, but I shall know him, I hope. Don't you think so?" said Mr. Bolter. "I'm doubtful about it," replied Fagin with a sigh. "If they don't get any fresh evidence, it'll only be a summary conviction, and we shall have him back again after 6 weeks or so. But if they do, it's a case of lagging. They know what a clever lad he is. He'll be a lifer. They'll make the artful nothing less than a lifer." "What do you mean by a lagging and a lifer?" demanded Mr. Bolter. "What's the good of talking in that way to me? Why don't you speak so as I can understand you?" Fagin was about to translate these mysterious expressions into the vulgar tongue, and being interpreted, Mr. Bolter would have been informed that they represented the combination of words transportation for life, when the dialogue was cut short by the entry of Master Bates, with his hands in his breeches pockets, and his face twisted into a look of semi-comical woe. "He's all up, Fagin," said Charley, when he and his new companion had been made known to each other. "What do you mean?" "They found the gentleman as owns the box. 2 or 3 more's a coming to identify him, and the Artful's booked for the passage out," replied Master Bates. "I must have a full suit of mourning, Fagin, and a hatband to visit him in, afore he sets out upon his travels. To think of it, Jack Dawkins, Lummy Jack, the Dodger, the Artful Dodger, going abroad for a common 2.5 sneeze box. I never thought he'd have done it under a gold watch, chain, and seals at the lowest. Oh, why didn't he rob some rich old gentleman of all his valuables, and go out as a gentleman, not like a common prig, without no honour, no glory?" With this expression of feeling for his unfortunate friend, Master Bates sat himself on the nearest chair with an aspect of chagrin and despondency. "What do you talk about his having neither honour nor glory for?" exclaimed Fagin, darting an angry look at his pupil. "Wasn't he always the top sawyer among you all? Is there one of you that could touch him or come near him on any sense, eh?" "Not one," replied Master Bates, in a voice rendered husky by regret. "Not one? Then what do you talk of?" replied Fagin angrily. "What are you blubbering for?" "'Cause it isn't on the record, is it?" said Charley, chafed into perfect defiance of his venerable friend by the current of his regrets. "'Cause it ain't come out in the indictment. 'Cause nobody'll ever know half o' what he was. How will he stand in the Newgate calendar? Perhaps not be there at all. Oh, my eye, what a blow it is!" cried Fagin, extending his right hand, and turning to Mr. Bolter in a fit of chuckling which shook him as though he had the palsy. "See what pride they take in their profession, my dear. Ain't it beautiful?" Mr. Bolter nodded assent, and Fagin, after contemplating the grief of Charley Bates for some seconds with evident satisfaction, stepped up to that young gentleman and patted him on the shoulder. "Never mind, Charley," said Fagin soothingly. It'll come out. It'll be sure to come out. They all know what a clever lad he was. He'd show it himself, and not disgrace his old pals and teachers. Think how young he is, too. What a distinction, Charlie, to be lagged at his time of life." "Well, it is a honour, that is," said Charlie, a little consoled. "He shall have all he wants," continued the Jew. "He shall be kept in the stone jug, Charlie, like a gentleman, with his beer every day, and money in his pocket to pitch and toss with if he can't spend it." "Now, shall he, though?" cried Charlie Bates. "Aye, that he shall," replied Fagin. "And we'll have a big wig, Charlie, one that's got the greatest gift of the gab, to carry on his defence. And he'll make a perfect speech for himself, too, if he likes, and we'll read it all in the papers. Artful dodger, shrieks of laughter, here the court was convulsed, eh, Charlie, eh?" "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Master Bates. "What a laugh that would be, wouldn't it, Fagin? I say, how the Artful would bother them, wouldn't he?" "Would?" cried Fagin. "He shall, he will." "Ah, to be sure, so he will," repeated Charlie, rubbing his hands. "I think I see him now," cried the Jew, bending his eyes upon his pupil. "So do I," cried Charlie Bates. "Ah, so do I. I see it all afore me, upon my soul I do, Fagin. What a game! What a regular game! All the big wigs trying to look solemn, and Jack Dawkins addressing of 'em as intimate and comfortable as if he was the judge's own son, making a speech after dinner." In fact, Mr. Fagin had so well humoured his young friend's eccentric disposition that Master Bates, who had at first been disposed to consider the imprisoned Dodger rather in the light of a victim, now looked upon him as the chief actor in a scene of most uncommon and exquisite humour, and felt quite impatient for the arrival of the time when his old companion should have so favourable an opportunity of displaying his abilities. "We must know how he gets on to-day by some handy means or other," said Fagin. "Let me think." "Shall I go?" asked Charlie. "Not for the world," replied Fagin. "Are you mad, my dear, stark mad, that you'd walk into the very place where— Now, Charlie, now, one is enough to lose at a time." "You don't mean to go yourself, I suppose?" said Charlie, with a humorous leer. "That wouldn't quite fit," replied Fagin, shaking his head. "Then why don't you send this new cove?" asked Master Bates, laying his hand on Noah's arm. "Nobody knows him." "Why, if he didn't mind," observed Fagin. "Mind?" interposed Charlie. "What should he have to mind?" "Really nothing, my dear," said Fagin, turning to Mr. Bolter. "Really nothing." "Oh, I daresay about that, you know," observed Noah, backing towards the door and shaking his head with a kind of sober alarm. "No, no, none of that. It's not my department, that ain't." "What department has he got, Fagin?" inquired Master Bates, surveying Noah's lank form with much disgust. "The cutting away when there's anything wrong, and the eating of all the victuals when there's everything right? Is that his branch?" "Never mind," retorted Mr. Bolter, "and don't you take liberties with your superiors, little boy, or you'll find yourself in the wrong shop." Master Bates laughed so vehemently at this magnificent threat that it was some time before Fagin could interpose, and represent to Mr. Bolter that he incurred no possible danger in visiting the police office; that, inasmuch as no account of the little affair in which he had engaged, nor any description of his person, had yet been forwarded to the metropolis, it was very probable that he was not even suspected of having resorted to it for shelter, and that, if he were properly disguised, it would be as safe a spot for him to visit as any in London, inasmuch as it would be, of all places, the very last to which he could be supposed likely to resort of his own free will. Persuaded in part by these representations, but overborne in a much greater degree by his fear of Fagin, Mr. Bolter at length consented, with a very bad grace, to undertake the expedition. By Fagin's directions he immediately substituted for his own attire a waggoner's frock, velveteen breeches, and leather leggings, all of which articles the Jew had at hand. He was likewise furnished with a felt hat well garnished with turnpike tickets, and a carter's whip. Thus equipped, he was to saunter into the office, as some country fellow from Covent Garden Market might be supposed to do, for the gratification of his curiosity; and as he was as awkward, ungainly, and raw-boned a fellow as need be, Mr. Fagin had no fear but that he would look the part to perfection. These arrangements completed, he was informed of the necessary signs and tokens by which to recognize the Artful Dodger, and was conveyed by Master Bates through dark and winding ways to within a very short distance of Bow Street.
Having described the precise situation of the office, and accompanied it with copious directions how he was to walk straight up the passage, and when he got into the yard take the door up the steps on the right-hand side, and pull off his hat as he went into the room, Charley Bates bade him hurry on alone, and promised to bide his return on the spot of their parting. Noah Claypole, or Morris Bolter, as the reader pleases, punctually followed the directions he had received, which, Master Bates being pretty well acquainted with the locality, were so exact that he was able to gain the magisterial presence without asking any question, or meeting with any interruption by the way. He found himself jostled among a crowd of people, chiefly women, who were huddled together in a dirty, frowsy room, at the upper end of which was a raised platform railed off from the rest, with a dock for the prisoners on the left hand against the wall, a box for the witnesses in the middle, and a desk for the magistrates on the right. The awful locality last named being screened off by a partition which concealed the bench from the common gaze, and left the vulgar to imagine, if they could, the full majesty of justice. There were only a couple of women in the dock, who were nodding to their admiring friends while the clerk read some depositions to a couple of policemen and a man in plain clothes who leant over the table. A gaoler stood reclining against the dock rail, tapping his nose listlessly with a large key, except when he repressed an undue tendency to conversation among the idlers by proclaiming silence, or looked sternly up to bid some woman take that baby out, when the gravity of justice was disturbed by feeble cries, half smothered in the mother's shawl, from some meagre infant. The room smelt close and unwholesome, the walls were dirt-discoloured, and the ceiling blackened. There was an old smoky bust over the mantel-shelf, and a dusty clock above the dock, the only thing present that seemed to go on as it ought, for depravity or poverty, or the habitual acquaintance with both, had left a taint on all the animate matter, hardly less unpleasant than the thick greasy scum on every inanimate object that frowned upon it. Noah looked eagerly about him for the Dodger, but although there were several women who would have done very well for that distinguished character's mother or sister, and more than one man who might be supposed to bear a strong resemblance to his father, nobody at all answering the description given him of Mr. Dawkins was to be seen. He waited in a state of much suspense and uncertainty until all the women, being committed for trial, went flaunting out, and then was quickly relieved by the appearance of another prisoner, who he felt at once could be no other than the object of his visit. It was indeed Mr. Dawkins, who, shuffling into the office with the big coat sleeves tucked up as usual, his left hand in his pocket, and his hat in his right hand, preceded the gaoler with a rolling gait altogether indescribable, and taking his place in the dock, requested in an audible voice to know what he was placed in that 'ere disgraceful situation for. "Hold your tongue, will you?" said the gaoler. "I'm an Englishman, ain't I?" rejoined the Dodger. "Where are my privileges?" "You get your privileges soon enough," retorted the gaoler, "and pepper with 'em." "We'll see what the Secretary of State for the Home Affairs has got to say to the beaks if I don't," replied Mr. Dawkins. "Now then, what is this here business? I shall thank the magistrates to dispose of this little here affair, and not to keep me while they read the paper, for I've got an appointment with a gentleman in the city, and as I am a man of my word and very punctual in business matters, he'll go away if I ain't there to my time, and then perhaps there won't be an action for damage against them as kept me away. Oh no, certainly not." At this point the Dodger, with a show of being very particular with a view to proceedings to be had thereafter, desired the gaoler to communicate "the names of them two files as was on the bench," which so tickled the spectators that they laughed almost as heartily as Master Bates could have done if he had heard the request. "Silence there!" cried the gaoler. "What is this?" inquired one of the magistrates. "A pickpocketing case, your worship." "Has the boy ever been here before?" "He ought to have been a many times," replied the gaoler. "He has been pretty well everywhere else. I know him well, your worship." "Oh, you know me, do you?" cried the Artful, making a note of the statement. "Very good. That's a case of deformation of character, anyway." Here there was another laugh, and another cry of silence. "Now then, where are the witnesses?" said the clerk. "Ah, that's right," said the Dodger. "Where are they? I should like to see 'em." This wish was immediately gratified, for a policeman stepped forward, who had seen the prisoner attempt the pocket of an unknown gentleman in a crowd, and indeed taken a handkerchief therefrom, which, being a very old one, he deliberately put back again, after trying it on his own countenance. For this reason he took the Dodger into custody as soon as he could get near him,
and the said Dodger, being searched, had upon his person a silver snuff-box with the owner's name engraved upon the lid. This gentleman had been discovered on reference to the court guide, and being then and there present, swore that the snuff-box was his, and that he had missed it on the previous day, the moment he had disengaged himself from the crowd before referred to. He had also remarked a young gentleman in the throng, particularly active in making his way about, and that young gentleman was the prisoner before him. "Have you anything to ask the witness, boy?" said the magistrate. "I wouldn't abase myself by descending to hold no conversation with him," replied the Dodger. "Have you anything to say at all?" "Do you hear his worship asking if you've anything to say?" inquired the gaoler, nudging the silent Dodger with his elbow. "I beg your pardon?" said the Dodger, looking up with an air of abstraction. "Did you address yourself to me, my man?" "I never see such a out-and-out wagabond, your worship," observed the officer with a grin. "Do you mean to say anything, you young shaver?" "No," replied the Dodger, "not here, for this ain't the shop for justice. Besides which, my attorney is a breakfasting this morning with the Vice President of the House of Commons. But I shall have something to say elsewhere, and so will he, and so will a very numerous and spectable circle of acquaintances as'll make them beaks wish they'd never been born, or that they'd got their footmen to hang them up to their own hat pegs afore they let them come out this morning to try it upon me. I'll—" "There, he's fully committed," interposed the clerk. "Take him away." "Come on," said the gaoler. "I'll come on," replied the Dodger, brushing his hat with the palm of his hand. To the bench. "It's no use your looking frightened. I won't show no mercy, not a ha'porth worth of it. You'll pay for this, my fine fellers. I wouldn't be you for something. I wouldn't go free now if you was to fall down on your knees and ask me. Here, carry me off to prison, take me away." With these last words the Dodger suffered himself to be led off by the collar, threatening, till he got into the yard, to make a parliamentary business of it, and then grinning in the officer's face with great glee and self-approval. Having seen him locked up by himself in a little cell, no one made the best of his way back to where he had left Master Bates. After waiting here some time, he was joined by that young gentleman, who had prudently abstained from showing himself until he had looked carefully abroad from a snug retreat, and ascertained that his new friend had not been followed by any impertinent person. The two hastened back together to bear to Mr. Fagin the animating news that the Dodger was doing full justice to his bringing up, and establishing for himself a glorious reputation. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The time arrives for Nancy to redeem her pledge to Rose Maylie. She fails. Adept as she was in all the arts of cunning and dissimulation, the girl Nancy could not wholly conceal the effect which the knowledge of the step she had taken wrought upon her mind. She remembered that both the crafty Jew and the brutal Sikes had confided to her schemes which had been hidden from all others, in the full confidence that she was trustworthy and beyond the reach of their suspicion. Vile as those schemes were, desperate as were their originators, and bitter as were her feelings towards Fagin, who had led her step by step deeper and deeper down into an abyss of crime and misery, whence was no escape, still there were times when even towards him she felt some relenting, lest her disclosure should bring him within the iron grasp he had so long eluded, and he should fall at last, richly as he merited such a fate, by her hand. But these were the mere wanderings of a mind unable wholly to detach itself from old companions and associations, though unable to fix itself steadily on one object, and resolved not to be turned aside by any consideration. Her fears for Sikes would have been more powerful inducements to recoil while there was yet time. But she had stipulated that her secret should be rigidly kept. She had dropped no clue which could lead to his discovery. She had refused, even for his sake, a refuge from all the guilt and wretchedness that encompassed her. And what more could she do? She was resolved. Though all her mental struggles terminated in this conclusion, they forced themselves upon her again and again, and left their traces too. She grew pale and thin even within a few days. At times she took no heed of what was passing before her, or no part in conversations where once she would have been the loudest. At other times she laughed without merriment, and was noisy without cause or meaning. At others, often within a moment afterwards, she sat silent and dejected, brooding with her head upon her hands, while the very effort by which she roused herself told more forcibly than even these indications that she was ill at ease, and that her thoughts were occupied by matters very different and distant from those in the course of discussion by her companions. It was Sunday night, and the bell of the nearest church struck the hour. Sikes and the Jew were talking, but they paused to listen. The girl looked up from the low seat on which she crouched, and listened too. 11. "An hour this side of midnight," said Sikes, raising the blind to look out and returning to his seat. "Dark and heavy it is too. A good night for business, this." "Ah," replied Fagin, "what a pity, Bill, my dear, that there's none quite ready to be done." "You're right for once," replied Sikes gruffly. "It's a pity, for I'm in the humour to." Fagin sighed and shook his head despondingly. "We must make up for lost time when we got things into a good train, that's all I know," said Sikes. "That's the way to talk, my dear," replied Fagin, venturing to pat him on the shoulder. "It does me good to hear you." "Does you good, does it?" cried Sikes. "Well, so be it." laughed Fagin, as if he were relieved even by this concession. "You're like yourself to-night, Bill, quite like yourself." "I don't feel like myself when you lay that withered old claw on my shoulder, so take it away," said Sikes, casting off the Jew's hand. "It makes you nervous, Bill? Reminds you of being nabbed, does it?" said Fagin, determined not to be offended. "Reminds me of being nabbed by the devil," returned Sikes. "There never was another man with such a face as yours, unless it was your father, and I suppose he is singeing his grizzled beard by this time, unless you came straight from the old un without any father at all betwixt you, which I shouldn't wonder at a bit." Fagin offered no reply to this compliment, but pulling Sikes by the sleeve, pointed his finger towards Nancy, who had taken advantage of the foregoing conversation to put on her bonnet, and was now leaving the room. "Hallo!" cried Sikes. "Nance, where's the girl going at this time o' night?" "Not far." "What answer's that?" retorted Sikes. "Do you hear me?" "I don't know where," replied the girl. "Then I do," said Sikes, more in the spirit of obstinacy than because he had any real objection to the girl going where she liked. "Nowhere. Sit down." "I'm not well. I told you that before," rejoined the girl. "I want a breath of air." "Put your head out of the window," replied Sikes. "There's not enough there," said the girl. "I want it in the street." "Then you won't have it," replied Sikes, with which assurance he rose, locked the door, took the key out, and pulling her bonnet from her head, flung it upon the top of an old press. "There," said the robber. "Now stop quietly where you are, will you?" "It's not such a matter as a bonnet would keep me," said the girl, turning very pale. "What do you mean, Bill? Do you know what you're doing?" "Know what I'm? Ah," said Sikes, turning to Fagin, "she's out of her senses, you know, or she daren't talk to me in that way." "You'll drive me on to something desperate," muttered the girl, placing both her hands upon her breast, as though to keep down by force some violent outbreak. "Let me go, will you? This minute, this instant." "Now," said Sikes. "Tell him to let me go, Fagin. He had better. It'll be better for him, do you hear me?" cried Nancy, stamping her foot upon the ground. "Hear you?" repeated Sikes, turning round in his chair to confront her. "Aye, and if I hear you for half a minute longer, the dog shall have such a grip on your throat as 'll tear some of that screaming voice out. What has come over you, you jade? What is it?" "Let me go," said the girl with great earnestness. Then, sitting herself down on the floor before the door, she said, "Bill, let me go. You don't know what you're doing. You don't indeed. For only 1 hour. Do, do." "Cut my limbs off one by one," said Sikes, seizing her roughly by the arm, "if I don't think the girl's stark raving mad. Get up." "Not till you let me go. Not till you let me go. Never, never!" screamed the girl. Sikes looked on for a minute, waiting his opportunity, and suddenly pinioning her hands, dragged her, struggling and wrestling with him by the way, into a small adjoining room, where he sat himself on a bench, and thrusting her into a chair, held her down by force. She struggled and implored by turns until 12 o'clock had struck, and then, wearied and exhausted, ceased to contest the point any further. With a caution, backed by many oaths, to make no more efforts to go out that night, Sikes left her to recover at leisure, and rejoined Fagin. "Phew!" said the housebreaker, wiping the perspiration from his face. "What a precious strange gal that is!" "You may say that, Bill," replied Fagin thoughtfully. "You may say that." "What did she take it into her head to go out to-night for, do you think?" asked Sikes. "Come, you should know her better than me. What does it mean?" "Obstinacy. Woman's obstinacy, I suppose, my dear." "Well, I suppose it is," growled Sikes. "I thought I had tamed her, but she's as bad as ever." "Worse," said Fagin thoughtfully. "I never knew her like this for such a little cause." "Nor I," said Sikes. "I think she's got a touch of that fever in her blood yet, and it won't come out, eh?" "Like enough." "I'll let her a little blood without troubling the doctor if she's took that way again," said Sikes. Fagin nodded an expressive approval of this mode of treatment. "She was hanging about me all day and all night too when I was stretched on my back, and you, like a black-hearted wolf as you are, kept yourself aloof," said Sikes. "We was poor too all the time, and I think one way or other it's worried and fretted her, and that being shut up here as long has made her restless, eh?" "That's it, my dear," replied the Jew in a whisper. "Hush!" As he uttered these words the girl herself appeared and resumed her former seat. Her eyes were swollen and red, and she rocked herself to and fro, tossed her head, and after a little time burst out laughing. "Why, now she's on the other track!" exclaimed Sikes, turning a look of excessive surprise on his companion. Fagin nodded to him to take no further notice just then, and in a few minutes the girl subsided into her accustomed demeanour. Whispering Sikes that there was no fear of her relapsing, Fagin took up his hat and bade him good night. He paused when he reached the room door, and looking round, asked if somebody would light him down the dark stairs. "Light him down," said Sikes, who was filling his pipe. "It's a pity he should break his neck himself, and disappoint the sightseers. Show him a light." Nancy followed the old man downstairs with a candle. When they reached the passage he laid his finger on his lip, and drawing close to the girl said in a whisper, "What is it, Nancy dear?" "What do you mean?" replied the girl in the same tone. "The reason of all this," replied Fagin. "If he pointed with his skinny forefinger up the stairs, "is too hard with you, he's a brute, Nance, a brute beast, why don't you—" "Well," said the girl, as Fagin paused, with his mouth almost touching her ear, and his eyes looking into hers. "No matter just now. We'll talk of this again. You have a friend in me, Nance, a staunch friend. I have the means at hand, quiet and close. If you want revenge on those that treat you like a dog, worse than his dog, for he humours him sometimes, come to me. I say come to me. He is the mere hound of a day, but you know me of old, Nance." "I know you well," replied the girl, without manifesting the least emotion. "Good night." She shrank back as Fagin offered to lay his hand on hers, but said good night again in a steady voice, and answering his parting look with a nod of intelligence, closed the door between them. Fagin walked towards his home, intent upon the thoughts that were working within his brain. He had conceived the idea, not from what had just passed, though that had tended to confirm him, but slowly and by degrees, that Nancy, wearied of the housebreaker's brutality, had conceived an attachment for some new friend. Her altered manner, her repeated absences from home alone, her comparative indifference to the interests of the gang for which she had once been so zealous, and, added to these, her desperate impatience to leave home that night at a particular hour, all favoured the supposition, and rendered it, to him at least, almost matter of certainty. The object of this new liking was not among his myrmidons. He would be a valuable acquisition with such an assistant as Nancy, and must, thus Fagin argued, be secured without delay. There was another, a darker object to be gained. Sikes knew too much, and his ruffian taunts had not galled Fagin the less because the wounds were hidden. The girl must know well that if she shook him off she could never be safe from his fury, and that it would be surely wreaked to the maiming of limbs, or perhaps the loss of life, on the object of her more recent fancy. With a little persuasion, thought Fagin, what more likely than that she would consent to poison him? Women have done such things, and worse, to secure the same object before now. There would be the dangerous villain, the man I hate, gone, another secured in his place, and my influence over the girl, with a knowledge of this crime to back it, unlimited. These things passed through the mind of Fagin during the short time he sat alone in the housebreaker's room, and with them uppermost in his thoughts he had taken the opportunity afterwards afforded him of sounding the girl in the broken hints he threw out at parting. There was no expression of surprise, no assumption of an inability to understand his meaning. The girl clearly comprehended it. Her glance at parting showed that. But perhaps she would recoil from a plot to take the life of Sikes, and that was one of the chief ends to be attained. How, thought Fagin, as he crept homeward, can I increase my influence with her? What new power can I acquire? Such brains are fertile expedients. If, without extracting a confession from herself, he laid a watch, discovered the object of her altered regard, and threatened to reveal the whole history to Sikes, of whom she stood in no common fear, unless she entered into his designs, could he not secure her compliance? "I can," said Fagin almost aloud. "She durst not refuse me then. Not for her life. Not for her life. I have it all. The means are ready, and shall be set to work. I shall have you yet." He cast back a dark look and a threatening motion of the hand towards the spot where he had left the bolder villain, and went on his way, busying his bony hands in the folds of his tattered garment, which he wrenched tightly in his grasp, as though there were a hated enemy crushed with every motion of his fingers. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Noah Claypole is employed by Fagin on a secret mission. The old man was up betimes next morning, and waited impatiently for the appearance of his new associate, who, after a delay that seemed interminable, at length presented himself, and commenced a voracious assault on the breakfast. "Bolter," said Fagin, drawing up a chair and seating himself opposite Maurice Bolter. "Well, here I am," returned Noah. "What's the matter? Don't you ask me to do anything till I've done eating. That's a great fault in this place. You never get time enough over your meals." "You can talk as you eat, can't you?" said Fagin, cursing his dear young friend's greediness from the very bottom of his heart. "Oh yes, I can talk. I get on better when I talk," said Noah, cutting a monstrous slice of bread. "Where's Charlotte?" "Out," said Fagin. "I sent her out this morning with the other young woman, because I wanted us to be alone." "Oh," said Noah, "I wish you'd ordered her to make some buttered toast first. Well, talk away. You won't interrupt me." There seemed indeed no great fear of anything interrupting him, as he had evidently sat down with a determination to do a great deal of business. "You did very well yesterday, my dear," said Fagin. "Beautiful. 6 shillings and 9pence halfpenny on the very first day. The kitchen lay will be a fortune to you." "Don't you forget to add 3 pint pots and a milk can," said Mr. Bolter. "No, no, my dear. The pint pots were great strokes of genius, but the milk can was a perfect masterpiece." "Pretty well, I think, for a beginner," remarked Mr. Bolter complacently. "The pots I took off airy railings, and the milk can was standing by itself outside the public house. I thought it might get rusty with the rain, or catch cold, you know, eh?" Fagin affected to laugh very heartily, and Mr. Bolter, having had his laugh out, took a series of large bites, which finished his first hunk of bread and butter, and assisted himself to a second. "I want you, Bolter," said Fagin, leaning over the table, "to do a piece of work for me, my dear, that needs great care and caution." "I say," rejoined Bolter, "don't you go shoving me into danger, or sending me any more of your police officers. That don't suit me, that don't, and so I tell you." "There's not the smallest danger in it, not the very smallest," said the Jew. "It's only to dodge a woman." "An old woman?" demanded Mr. Bolter. "A young one," replied Fagin. "I can do that pretty well, I know," said Bolter. "I was a regular cunning sneak when I was at school. What am I to dodge her for? Not to do anything, but to tell me where she goes, who she sees, and, if possible, what she says. To remember the street, if it is a street, or the house, if it is a house, and to bring back all the information you can." "What'll you give me?" asked Noah, setting down his cup and looking his employer eagerly in the face. "If you do it well, £1, my dear." £1, said Fagin, wishing to interest him in the scent as much as possible. And that's what I never gave yet for any job of work where there wasn't valuable consideration to be gained." "Who is she?" inquired Noah. "One of us." "Oh, law!" cried Noah, curling up his nose. "You're doubtful of it, are you?" "She has found out some new friends, my dear, and I must know who they are," replied Fagin. "I see," said Noah. "Just to have the pleasure of knowing them, if they're respectable people, eh? I'm your man." "I knew you would be," cried Fagin, elated by the success of his proposal. Of course," replied Noah. "Where is she? Where am I to wait for her? Where am I to go?" "All that, my dear, you shall hear from me. I'll point her out to you at the proper time," said Fagin. "You keep ready, and leave the rest to me." That night, and the next again, the spy sat booted and equipped in his carter's dress, ready to turn out at a word from Fagin. 6 nights passed, 6 long weary nights, and on each Fagin came home with a disappointed face, and briefly intimated that it was not yet time. On the 7th he returned earlier, and with an exultation he could not conceal. It was Sunday. "She goes abroad to-night," said Fagin, "and on the right errand, I'm sure, for she has been alone all day, and the man she is afraid of will not be back much before daybreak. Come with me, quick." Noah started up without saying a word, for the Jew was in a state of such intense excitement that it infected him. They left the house stealthily, and hurrying through a labyrinth of streets, arrived at length before a public house, which Noah recognized as the same in which he had slept on the night of his arrival in London. It was past 11 o'clock, and the door was closed. It opened softly on its hinges as Fagin gave a low whistle. They entered without noise, and the door was closed behind them. Scarcely venturing to whisper, but substituting dumb show for words, Fagin and the young Jew who had admitted them pointed out the pane of glass to Noah, and signed to him to climb up and observe the person in the adjoining room. "Is that the woman?" he asked, scarcely above his breath. Fagin nodded yes. "I can't see her face well," whispered Noah. "She's looking down, and the candle is behind her." "Stay there," whispered Fagin. He signed to Barney, who withdrew. In an instant the lad entered the room adjoining, and under pretence of snuffing the candle, moved it in the required position, and speaking to the girl caused her to raise her face. "I see her now," cried the spy. "Plainly?" "I should know it among 1,000. He hastily descended as the room door opened and the girl came out. Fagin drew him behind a small partition which was curtained off, and they held their breaths as she passed within a few feet of their place of concealment, and emerged by the door at which they had entered. "Hist!" cried the lad who held the door. "Now!" Noah exchanged a look with Fagin, and darted out. "To the left," whispered the lad. "Take the left hand, and keep on the other side." He did so, and by the light of the lamps saw the girl's retreating figure already at some distance before him. He advanced as near as he considered prudent, and kept on the opposite side of the street, the better to observe her motions. She looked nervously round twice or thrice, and once stopped to let 2 men who were following close behind her pass on. She seemed to gather courage as she advanced, and to walk with a steadier and firmer step. The spy preserved the same relative distance between them, and followed, with his eye upon her. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The appointment kept. The church clocks chimed 11:75 as 2 figures emerged on London Bridge. One, which advanced with a swift and rapid step, was that of a woman who looked eagerly about her as though in quest of some expected object. The other figure was that of a man, who slunk along in the deepest shadow he could find, and at some distance accommodated his pace to hers, stopping when she stopped, and as she moved again creeping stealthily on, but never allowing himself, in the ardour of his pursuit, to gain upon her footsteps. Thus they crossed the bridge from the Middlesex to the Surrey shore, when the woman, apparently disappointed in her anxious scrutiny of the foot-passengers, turned back. The movement was sudden, but he who watched her was not thrown off his guard by it, for shrinking into one of the recesses which surmount the piers of the bridge, and leaning over the parapet to better conceal his figure, he suffered her to pass on the opposite pavement.
When she was about the same distance in advance as she had been before, he slipped quietly down and followed her again. At nearly the centre of the bridge she stopped. The man stopped too. It was a very dark night. The day had been unfavourable, and at that hour and place there were few people stirring. Such as there were hurried quickly past, very possibly without seeing, but certainly without noticing, either the woman or the man who kept her in view. Their appearance was not calculated to attract the importunate regards of such of London's destitute population as chanced to take their way over the bridge that night in search of some cold arch or doorless hovel wherein to lay their heads. They stood there in silence, neither speaking nor spoken to by any one who passed. A mist hung over the river, deepening the red glare of the fires that burnt on the small craft moored off the different wharfs, and rendering darker and more indistinct the murky buildings on the banks. The old smoke-stained storehouses on either side rose heavy and dull from the dense mass of roofs and gables, and frowned sternly upon water too black to reflect even their lumbering shapes. The tower of old St. Saviour's Church and the spire of St. Magnus, so long the giant warders of the ancient bridge, were visible in the gloom, but the forest of shipping below the bridge and the thickly scattered spires of churches above were nearly all hidden from sight. The girl had taken a few restless turns to and fro, closely watched meanwhile by her hidden observer, when the heavy bells of St. Paul's tolled for the death of another day. Midnight had come upon the crowded city. The palace, the night cellar, the jail, the madhouse, the chambers of birth and death, of health and sickness, the rigid face of the corpse and the calm sleep of the child, midnight was upon them all. The hour had not struck 2 minutes when a young lady, accompanied by a grey-haired gentleman, alighted from a hackney carriage within a short distance of the bridge, and, having dismissed the vehicle, walked straight towards it. They had scarcely set foot upon its pavement when the girl started and immediately made towards them. They walked onward, looking about them with the air of persons who entertained some very slight expectation which had little chance of being realized, when they were suddenly joined by this new associate. They halted with an exclamation of surprise, but suppressed it immediately, for a man in the garments of a countryman came close up, brushed against them indeed, at that precise moment. "Not here," said Nancy hurriedly. "I am afraid to speak to you here. Come away, out of the public road. Down the steps yonder." As she uttered these words, and indicated with her hand the direction in which she wished him to proceed, the countryman looked round, and roughly asking what they took up the whole pavement for, passed on. The steps to which the girl had pointed were those which, on the Surrey bank, and on the same side of the bridge as St. Saviour's Church, form a landing stairs from the river. To this spot the man bearing the appearance of a countryman hastened unobserved, and after a moment's survey of the place he began to descend. These stairs are a part of the bridge. They consist of 3 flights. Just below the end of the second, going down, the stone wall on the left terminates in an ornamental pilaster, facing towards the Thames. At this point the lower steps widen, so that a person turning that angle of the wall is necessarily unseen by any others on the stairs who chance to be above him, if only a step. The countryman looked hastily round when he reached this point, and as there seemed no better place of concealment, and, the tide being out, there was plenty of room, he slipped aside with his back to the pilaster, and there waited, pretty certain that they would come no lower, and that even if he could not hear what was said, he could follow them again with safety. So tardily stole the time in this lonely place, and so eager was the spy to penetrate the motives of an interview so different from what he had been led to expect, that he more than once gave the matter up for lost, and persuaded himself either that they had stopped far above, or had resorted to some entirely different spot to hold their mysterious conversation. He was on the point of emerging from his hiding-place and regaining the road above, when he heard the sound of footsteps, and directly afterwards of voices almost close at his ear. He drew himself straight upright against the wall, and, scarcely breathing, listened attentively. "This is far enough," said a voice, which was evidently that of the gentleman. "I will not suffer the young lady to go any farther. Many people would have distrusted you too much to have come even so far, but you see I am willing to humour you." "To humour me!" cried the voice of the girl whom he had followed. "You're considerate indeed, sir. To humour me! Well, it's no matter." "Why, for what?" said the gentleman in a kinder tone. "For what purpose can you have brought us to this strange place?
Why not have let me speak to you above there, where there is light, and there is something stirring, instead of bringing us to this dark and dismal hole?' 'I told you before,' replied Nancy, 'that I was afraid to speak to you there. I don't know why it is,' said the girl, shuddering, 'but I have such a fear and dread upon me to-night that I can hardly stand.' 'A fear of what?' asked the gentleman, who seemed to pity her. 'I scarcely know of what,' replied the girl. 'I wish I did. Horrible thoughts of death, and shrouds with blood upon them, and a fear that has made me burn as if I was on fire, have been upon me all day. I was reading a book to-night, to while away the time, and the same things came into the print.' 'Imagination,' said the gentleman, soothing her. 'No imagination,' replied the girl in a hoarse voice. 'I'll swear I saw coffin written in every page of the book in large black letters. Aye, and they carried one close to me in the streets to-night.' 'There is nothing unusual in that,' said the gentleman. 'They have passed me often.' 'Real ones,' rejoined the girl. 'This was not.' There was something so uncommon in her manner that the flesh of the concealed listener crept as he heard the girl utter these words, and the blood chilled within him. He had never experienced a greater relief than in hearing the sweet voice of the young lady as she begged her to be calm, and not allow herself to become the prey of such fearful fancies. 'Speak to her kindly,' said the young lady to her companion. 'Poor creature, she seems to need it.' 'Your haughty religious people would have held their heads up to see me as I am to-night, and preached of flames and vengeance,' cried the girl. 'O dear lady, why aren't those who claim to be God's own folks as gentle and as kind to us poor wretches as you, who, having youth and beauty, and all that they have lost, might be a little proud instead of so much humbler?' 'Ah,' said the gentleman, 'a Turk turns his face after washing it well to the east, when he says his prayers. These good people, after giving their faces such a rub against the world as to take the smiles off, turn with no less regularity to the darkest side of heaven. Between the Mussulman and the Pharisee, commend me to the first.' These words appeared to be addressed to the young lady, and were perhaps uttered with a view of affording Nancy time to recover herself. The gentleman shortly afterwards addressed himself to her. 'You were not here last Sunday night?' he said. 'I couldn't come,' replied Nancy. 'I was kept by folks.' 'By whom?' 'Him that I told the young lady of before.' 'You were not suspected of holding any communication with anybody on the subject which has brought us here to-night, I hope?' asked the old gentleman. 'No,' replied the girl, shaking her head. 'It's not very easy for me to leave him unless he knows why. I couldn't have seen the lady when I did, but that I gave him a drink of laudanum before I came away.' 'Did he awake before you returned?' inquired the gentleman. 'No, and neither he nor any of them suspect me.' 'Good,' said the gentleman. 'Now, listen to me.' 'I am ready,' replied the girl, as he paused for a moment. 'This young lady,' the gentleman began, 'has communicated to me, and to some other friends who can be safely trusted, what you told her nearly a fortnight since. I confess to you that I had doubts at first whether you were to be implicitly relied upon, but now I firmly believe you are.' 'I am,' said the girl earnestly. 'I repeat that I firmly believe it. To prove to you that I am disposed to trust you, I tell you without reserve that we propose to extort the secret, whatever it may be, from the fear of this man Monks. But if, said the gentleman, he cannot be secured, or, if secured, cannot be acted upon as we wish, you must deliver up the Jew.' 'Fagin!' cried the girl, recoiling. 'That man must be delivered up by you,' said the gentleman. 'I will not do it. I will never do it,' replied the girl. 'Devil that he is, and worse than the devil as he has been to me, I will never do that.' 'You will not?' said the gentleman, who seemed fully prepared for this answer. 'Never,' returned the girl. 'Tell me why.' 'For one reason,' rejoined the girl firmly. 'For one reason that the lady knows and will stand by me in. I know she will, for I have her promise. And for this other reason besides, that bad life as he has led, I have led a bad life too. There are many of us who have kept the same courses together, and I'll not turn upon them who might, any of them, have turned upon me, but didn't, bad as they are.' 'Then,' said the gentleman quickly, as if this had been the point he had been aiming to attain, 'put Monks into my hands, and leave him to me to deal with.' 'What if he turns against the others?' 'I promise you that in that case, if the truth is forced from him, there the matter will rest. There must be circumstances in Oliver's little history which it would be painful to drag before the public eye, and if the truth is once elicited, they shall go scot free. And if it is not?" suggested the girl.
"Then," pursued the gentleman, "this Fagin shall not be brought to justice without your consent. In such a case I would show you reasons, I think, which would induce you to yield it."
"Have I the lady's promise for that?"
asked the girl.
"You have," replied Rose, "my true and faithful pledge." "Monks would never learn how you knew what you do?" said the girl after a short pause.
"Never," replied the gentleman. "The intelligence would be so brought to bear upon him that he could never even guess."
"I have been a liar and among liars from a little child," said the girl after another interval of silence. "But I will take your words."
After receiving an assurance from both that she might safely do so, she proceeded in a voice so low that it was often difficult for the listener to discover even the purport of what she said, to describe by name and situation the public house whence she had been followed that night. From the manner in which she occasionally paused, it appeared as if the gentleman were making some hasty notes of the information she communicated. When she had thoroughly explained the localities of the place, the best position from which to watch it without exciting observation, and the night and hour on which Monks was most in the habit of frequenting it, she seemed to consider for a few moments, for the purpose of recalling his features and appearances more forcibly to her recollection.
"He is tall," said the girl, "and a strongly made man, but not stout. He has a lurking walk, and as he walks, constantly looks over his shoulder, first on one side and then on the other. Don't forget that, for his eyes are sunk in his head so much deeper than any other man's that you might almost tell him by that alone. His face is dark, like his hair and eyes, and although he can't be more than 6 or 8 and 20, withered and haggard. His lips are often discoloured and disfigured with the marks of teeth, for he has desperate fits, and sometimes even bites his hands and covers them with wounds." "Why did you start?" said the girl, stopping suddenly. The gentleman replied in a hurried manner that he was not conscious of having done so, and begged her to proceed. "Part of this," said the girl, "I've drawn out from the other people at the house I tell you of, for I've only seen him twice, and both times he was covered up in a large cloak. I think that's all I can give you to know him by. Stay, though," she added. "Upon his throat, so high that you can see a part of it below his neckerchief when he turns his face, there is—" "A broad red mark, like a burn or scald?" cried the gentleman. "How's this?" said the girl. "You know him?"
The young lady uttered a cry of surprise, and for a few moments they were so still that the listener could distinctly hear them breathe. "I think so," said the gentleman, breaking silence. "I should by your description. We shall see. Many people are singularly like each other. It may not be the same." As he expressed himself to this effect with assumed carelessness, he took a step or two nearer the concealed spy, as the latter could tell from the distinctness with which he heard him mutter, "It must be he." "Now," he said, returning, so it seemed by the sound, to the spot where he had stood before, "you have given us most valuable assistance, young woman, and I wish you to be the better for it. What can I do to serve you?"
"Nothing," replied
Nancy. "You will not persist in saying that," rejoined the gentleman, with a voice and emphasis of kindness that might have touched a much harder and more obdurate heart. "Think now. Tell me."
"Nothing, sir," rejoined the girl, weeping.
"You can do nothing to help me.
"I am past all hope, indeed."
"You put yourself beyond its pale," said the gentleman. "The past has been a dreary waste to you, of youthful energies misspent, and such priceless treasures lavished, as the Creator bestows but once and never grants again. But for the future you may hope. I do not say that it is in our power to offer you peace of heart and mind, for that must come as you seek it, but a quiet asylum, either in England, or, if you fear to remain here, in some foreign country, is not only within the compass of our ability, but our most anxious wish to secure you. Before the dawn of morning, before this river wakes to the first glimpse of daylight, you should be placed as entirely beyond the reach of your former associates, and leave as utter an absence of all traces behind you as if you were to disappear from the earth this moment. Come, I would not have you go back to exchange one word with any old companion, or take one look at any old haunt, or breathe the very air which is pestilence and death to you. Quit them all, while there is time and opportunity."
"She will be persuaded now," cried the young lady. "She hesitates, I am sure."
"I fear not, my dear," said the gentleman.
"No, sir, I do not,"
replied the girl, after a short struggle.
"I am chained to my old life. I loathe and hate it now, but I cannot leave it. I must have gone too far to turn back. And yet I don't know, for if you had spoken to me so some time ago, I should have laughed it off. But,' she said, looking hastily round, 'this fear comes over me again. I must go home.' 'Home?' repeated the young lady, with a great stress upon the word. 'Home, lady,' rejoined the girl, 'to such a home as I have raised for myself with the work of my whole life. Let us part. I shall be watched or seen. Go, go. If I have done you any service, all I ask is that you leave me, and let me to go my way alone.' 'It is useless,' said the gentleman, with a sigh. 'We compromise her safety, perhaps, by staying here. We may have detained her longer than she expected already.' 'Yes, yes,' urged the girl, 'you have.' 'What,' cried the young lady, 'can be the end of this poor creature's life?' 'What?' repeated the girl. 'Look before you, lady. Look at the dark water. How many times do you read of such as I who spring into the tide, and leave no living thing to care for or bewail them? It may be years since, or it may be only months, but I shall come to that at last.' 'Do not speak thus, pray,' returned the young lady, sobbing. 'It will never reach your ears, dear lady, and God forbid such horrors should,' replied the girl. 'Good night, good night.' The gentleman turned away. 'This purse,' cried the young lady. 'Take it for my sake, that you may have some resource in an hour of need and trouble.' 'No,' replied the girl, 'I have not done this for money. Let me have that to think of. And yet, give me something that you have worn. I should like to have something. No, no, not a ring. Your gloves or handkerchief, anything that I can keep as has belonged to you, sweet lady. There, bless you. God bless you. Good night, good night.' The violent agitation of the girl, and the apprehension of some discovery which would subject her to ill usage and violence, seemed to determine the gentleman to leave her as she requested. The sound of retreating footsteps were audible, and the voices ceased. The two figures of the young lady and her companion soon afterwards appeared upon the bridge. They stopped at the summit of the stairs. 'Hark!' cried the young lady, listening. 'Did she call? I thought I heard her voice.' 'No, my love,' replied Mr. Brownlow, looking sadly back. 'She has not moved, and will not till we are gone.' Rose Maylie lingered, but the old gentleman drew her arm through his, and led her, with gentle force, away. As they disappeared, the girl sunk down nearly at her full length upon one of the stone stairs, and vented the anguish of her heart in bitter tears. After a time she arose, and with feeble and tottering steps ascended to the street. The astonished listener remained motionless on his post for some minutes afterwards, and having ascertained, with many cautious glances round him, that he was again alone, crept slowly from his hiding-place, and returned stealthily in the shade of the wall in the same manner as he had descended. Peeping out more than once when he reached the top, to make sure that he was unobserved, Noah Claypole darted away at his utmost speed, and made for the Jew's house as fast as his legs would carry him. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Fatal consequences. It was nearly 2 hours before daybreak, that time which in the autumn of the year may be truly called the dead of night, when the streets are silent and deserted, when even sounds appear to slumber, and profligacy and riot have staggered home to dream. It was at this still and silent hour that Fagin sat watching in his old lair, with face so distorted and pale, and eyes so red and bloodshot, that he looked less like a man than like some hideous phantom moist from the grave, and worried by an evil spirit. He sat crouching over a cold hearth, wrapped in an old torn coverlet, with his face turned towards a wasting candle that stood upon a table by his side. His right hand was raised to his lips, and as absorbed in thought he bit his long black nails, he disclosed among his toothless gums a few such fangs as should have been a dog's or a rat's. Stretched upon a mattress on the floor lay Noah Claypole, fast asleep. Towards him the old man sometimes directed his eyes for an instant, and then brought them back again to the candle, which, with a long burnt wick drooping almost double, and hot grease falling down in clots upon the table, plainly showed that his thoughts were busy elsewhere. Indeed they were. Mortification at the overthrow of his notable scheme, hatred of the girl who had dared to palter with strangers, and utter distrust of the sincerity of her refusal to yield him up, bitter disappointment at the loss of his revenge on Sikes, the fear of detection and ruin and death,
and a fierce and deadly rage kindled by all. These were the passionate considerations which, following close upon each other with rapid and ceaseless whirl, shot through the brain of Fagin, as every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. He sat without changing his attitude in the least, or appearing to take the smallest heed of time, until his quick ear seemed to be attracted by a footstep in the street. "At last!" he muttered, wiping his dry and fevered mouth. "At last!" The bell rang gently as he spoke. He crept upstairs to the door, and presently returned, accompanied by a man muffled to the chin, who carried a bundle under one arm. Sitting down and throwing back his outer coat, the man displayed the burly frame of Sikes. "There," he said, laying the bundle on the table. "Take care of that, and do the most you can with it. It's been trouble enough to get. I thought I should have been here 3 hours ago." Fagin laid his hand upon the bundle, and locking it in a cupboard, sat down again without speaking. But he did not take his eyes off the robber for an instant during this action. And now that they sat over against each other face to face, he looked fixedly at him, with his lips quivering so violently, and his face so altered by the emotions which had mastered him, that the housebreaker involuntarily drew back his chair, and surveyed him with a look of real affright. "What now?" cried Sikes. "What do you look at a man so for?" Fagin raised his right hand and shook his trembling forefinger in the air. But his passion was so great that the power of speech was for the moment gone. "Damn!" said Sikes, feeling in his breast with a look of alarm. "He's gone mad. I must look to myself here." "No, no," rejoined Fagin, finding his voice. "It's not. You're not the person, Bill. I've no fault to find with you." "Oh, you haven't you?" said Sikes, looking sternly at him, and ostentatiously passing a pistol into a more convenient pocket. "That's lucky, for one of us. Which one that is don't matter." "I've got that to tell you, Bill," said Fagin, drawing his chair nearer. "Will make you worse than me." "Aye," returned the robber with an incredulous air. "Tell away. Look sharp, or Nance will think I'm lost." "Lost!" cried Fagin. "She has pretty well settled that in her own mind already." Sikes looked with an aspect of great perplexity into the Jew's face, and reading no satisfactory explanation of the riddle there, clenched his collar in his huge hand and shook him soundly. "Speak, will you?" he said. "Or if you don't, it shall be for want of breath. Open your mouth and say what you've got to say in plain words. Out with it, you thundering old cur. Out with it." "Suppose that lad that's lying there—" began Fagin. Sikes turned round to where Noah was sleeping, as if he had not previously observed him. "Well," he said, resuming his former position. "Suppose that lad," pursued Fagin, "was to peach, to blow upon us all, first seeking out the right folks for the purpose, and then having a meeting with them in the street to paint our likenesses, describe every mark that they might know us by, and the crib where we might be most easily taken. Suppose he was to do all this, and besides to blow upon a plant we've all been in, more or less of his own fancy, not grabbed, trapped, tried, earwigged by the person, and brought to it on bread and water, but of his own fancy, to please his own taste, stealing out at nights to find those most interested against us, and peaching to them. Do you hear me?" cried the Jew, his eyes flashing with rage. "Suppose he did all this, what then?" "What then?" replied Sikes with a tremendous oath. "If he was left alive till I came, I'd grind his skull under the heel of my boot into as many grains as there are hairs upon his head." "What if I did it?" cried Fagin, almost in a yell. "I that know so much, and could hang so many besides myself." "I don't know," replied Sikes, clenching his teeth, and turning white at the mere suggestion. "I'd do something in the jail that'd get me put in irons. And if I was tried along with you, I'd fall upon you with 'em in the open court, and beat your brains out afore the people. I should have such strength," muttered the robber, poising his brawny arm, "that I could smash your head as if a loaded waggon had gone over it." "You would?" "Would I?" said the housebreaker. "Try me." "If it was Charlie, or the Dodger, or Bet, or—" "I don't care who," replied Sikes impatiently. "Whoever it was, I'd serve him the same." Fagin looked hard at the robber, and, motioning him to be silent, stooped over the bed upon the floor, and shook the sleeper to rouse him. Sikes leant forward in his chair, looking on with his hands upon his knees, as if wondering much what all this questioning and preparation was to end in. "Bolter, Bolter, poor lad!" said Fagin, looking up with an expression of devilish anticipation, and speaking slowly and with marked emphasis.
He's tired. Tired with watching for her so long. Watching for her, Bill.
What do you mean? asked Sikes, drawing back. Fagin made no answer, but bending over the sleeper again, hauled him into a sitting posture. When his assumed name had been repeated several times, Noah rubbed his eyes, and, giving a heavy yawn, looked sleepily about him.
"Tell me that again, once again, just for him to hear,"
said the Jew, pointing to Sikes as he spoke.
"Tell you what?"
asked the sleepy Noah, shaking himself pettishly.
"That about Nancy,"
said Fagin, clutching Sikes by the wrist as if to prevent his leaving the house before he had heard enough.
"You followed her?"
"Yes."
"To London Bridge?"
"Yes."
"Where she met two people?"
"So she did."
"A gentleman and a lady that she had gone to of her own accord before, who asked her to give up all her pals and monks first, which she did, and to describe 'em, which she did, and to tell her what house it was that we meet at and go to, which she did, and where it could be best watched from, which she did, and what time the people went there, which she did. She did all this. She told it all, every word, without a threat, without a murmur. She did she not?"
cried Fagin, half mad with fury. "All right," replied Noah, scratching his head. "That's just what it was."
"What did they say about last Sunday?"
"About last Sunday?" replied Noah, considering. "Why, I told you that before."
"Again! Tell it again!"
cried Fagin, tightening his grip on Sikes, and brandishing his other hand aloft as the foam flew from his lips. "They asked her," said Noah, who, as he grew more wakeful, seemed to have a dawning perception who Sikes was. "They asked her why she didn't come last Sunday as she promised. She said she couldn't."
Why? Tell him that."
"Because she was forcibly kept at home by Bill, the man she had told them of before," replied Noah.
"What more of him?"
cried Fagin.
"What more of the man she had told them of before? Tell him that! Tell him that!"
"Why, that she couldn't very easily get out of doors unless he knew where she was going to," said Noah. "And so the first time she went to see the lady, it made me laugh when she said it, that it did. She gave him a drink of laudanum."
"Hell's fire!"
cried Sikes, breaking fiercely from the Jew. "Let me go!" Flinging the old man from him, he rushed from the room and darted wild and furiously up the stairs.
Bill!
cried Fagin, following him hastily.
"A word! Only a word!"
The word would not have been exchanged, but that the housebreaker was unable to open the door, on which he was expending fruitless oaths and violence, when the Jew came panting up. "Let me out," said Sikes. "Don't speak to me, it's not safe. Let me out, I say."
"Hear me speak a word," rejoined Fagin, laying his hand upon the lock. "You won't be—"
"Well," replied the robber,
"you won't be too violent, Bill?"
The day was breaking, and there was light enough for the men to see each other's faces. They exchanged one brief glance. There was a fire in the eyes of both which could not be mistaken.
"I mean,"
said Fagin, showing that he felt all disguise was now useless,
"not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold."
Sikes made no reply, but pulling open the door, of which Fagin had turned the lock, dashed into the silent streets. Without one pause or moment's consideration, without once turning his head to the right or left, without raising his eyes to the sky or lowering them to the ground, but looking straight before him with savage resolution, his teeth so tightly compressed that the strained jaw seemed starting through his skin, the robber held on his headlong course, nor muttered a word nor relaxed a muscle until he reached his own door. He opened it softly with a key, strode lightly up the stairs, and entering his own room, double-locked the door, and lifting a heavy table against it, drew back the curtain of the bed. The girl was lying half-dressed upon it. He had roused her from her sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look. "Get up," said the man.
"Is it you, Bill?"
said the girl, with an expression of pleasure at his return.
"It is,"
was the reply.
"Get up."
There was a candle burning, but the man hastily drew it from the candlestick and hurled it under the grate. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain. "Let it be," said Sikes, thrusting his hand before her. "There's enough light for what I've got to do."
"Bill,"
said the girl, in a low voice of alarm,
"why do you look like that at me?"
The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds, with dilated nostrils and a heaving breast, and then, grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and looking once towards the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. "Bill! Bill!" gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. "I won't scream or cry, not once. Hear me, speak to me, tell me what I have done."
"You know, you she-devil," returned the robber, suppressing his breath. "You were watched to-night. Every word you said was heard."
"Then spare my life, for the love of heaven, as I spared yours," rejoined the girl, clinging to him. "Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Oh, think of all I have given up only this one night for you. You shall have time to think, and save yourself this crime. I will not loose my hold. You cannot throw me off. Bill, Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I have been true to you, upon my guilty soul I have." The man struggled violently to release his arms, but those of the girl were clasped round his, and tear her as he would, he could not tear them away. "Bill," cried the girl, striving to lay her head upon his breast, "the gentleman and that dear lady, they told me to-night of a home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again, and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you, and let us both leave this dreadful place, and far apart lead better lives, and forget how we have lived, except in prayers, and never see each other no more. It's never too late to repent. They told me so. I feel it now. But we must have time, a little time." The housebreaker freed one arm, and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind even in the midst of his fury, and he beat it twice with all the force he could summon upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own, and holding it up in her folded hands as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer staggering backwards to the wall, and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Flight of Sikes. Of all bad deeds that under cover of the darkness had been committed within wide London's bounds since night hung over it, that was the worst. Of all the horrors that rose with an ill scent upon the morning air, that was the foulest and most cruel. The sun, the bright sun that brings back not light alone, but new life and hope and freshness to man, burst upon the crowded city in clear and radiant glory. Through costly coloured glass and paper-mended window, through cathedral dome and rotten crevice, it shed its equal ray. It lighted up the room where the murdered woman lay. It did. He tried to shut it out, but it would stream in. If the sight had been a ghastly one in the dull morning, what was it now in all that brilliant light? He had not moved, he had been afraid to stir. There had been a moan and a motion of the hand, and, with terror added to rage, he had struck and struck again. Once he threw a rug over it, but it was worse to fancy the eyes and imagine them moving towards him than to see them glaring upward, as if watching the reflection of the pool of gore that quivered and danced in the sunlight on the ceiling. He had plucked it off again, and there was the body, mere flesh and blood no more, but such flesh and so much blood. He struck a light, kindled a fire, and thrust the club into it. There was hair upon the end, which blazed and shrunk into a light cinder, and, caught by the air, whirled up the chimney. Even that frightened him, sturdy as he was, but he held the weapon till it broke, and then piled it on the coals to burn away and smoulder into ashes. He washed himself and rubbed his clothes. There were spots that would not be removed, but he cut the pieces out and burnt them. How those stains were dispersed about the room! The very feet of the dog were bloody. All this time he had never once turned his back upon the corpse. No, not for a moment. Such preparations completed, he moved backward towards the door, dragging the dog with him, lest he should soil his feet anew and carry out new evidence of the crime into the streets. He shut the door softly, locked it, took the key, and left the house. He crossed over and glanced up at the window to be sure that nothing was visible from the outside. There was the curtain still drawn, which she would have opened to admit the light she never saw again. It lay nearly under there. He knew that. God, how the sun poured down upon the very spot! The glance was instantaneous. It was a relief to have got free of the room. He whistled on the dog, and walked rapidly away. He went through Islington, strode up the hill to Highgate, on which stands the stone in honour of Whittington, turned down into Highgate Hill, unsteady of purpose and uncertain where to go, struck off to the right again almost as soon as he began to descend it, and taking the footpath across the field, skirted Cane Wood, and so came on Hampstead Heath. Traversing the hollow by the Vale of Heath, he mounted the opposite bank, and crossing the road which joins the villages of Hampstead and Highgate, made along the remaining portion of the heath to the fields at North End, in one of which he laid himself down under a hedge and slept. Soon he was up again and away, not far into the country, but back towards London by the high road, then back again, then over another part of the same ground as he already traversed, then wandering up and down the fields, and lying on ditches' brinks to rest, and starting up to make for some other spot to do the same and ramble on again. Where could he go that was near and not too public to get some meat and drink? Hendon, that was a good place, not far off, and out of most people's way. Thither he directed his steps, running sometimes, and sometimes with a strange perversity, loitering at a snail's pace, or stopping altogether and idly breaking the hedges with a stick. But when he got there, all the people he met, the very children at the doors, seemed to view him with suspicion. Back he turned again, without the courage to purchase bit or drop, though he had tasted no food for many hours, and once more he lingered on the heath, uncertain where to go. He wandered over miles and miles of ground, and still came back to the old place. Morning and noon had passed, and the day was on the wane, and still he rambled to and fro, up and down, and round, and still lingered about the same spot. At last he got away, and shaped his course for Hatfield. It was 9 o'clock at night when the man, quite tired out, and the dog limping and lame from the unaccustomed exercise, turned down the hill by the church of the quiet village, and plodding along the little street, crept into a small public house, whose scanty light had guided them to the spot. There was a fire in the tap-room, and some country labourers were drinking before it. They made room for the stranger, but he sat down in the furthest corner, and ate and drank alone, or rather with his dog, to whom he cast a morsel of food from time to time. The conversation of the men assembled there turned upon the neighbouring land and farmers, and when those topics were exhausted, upon the age of some old man who had been buried on the previous Sunday, the young men present considering him very old, and the old men present declaring him to have been quite young, not older, one white-haired grandfather said, than he was, with 10 or 15 years of life in him at least, if he had taken care. If he had taken care. There was nothing to attract attention or excite alarm in this. The robber, after paying his reckoning, sat silent and unnoticed in his corner, and had almost dropped to sleep when he was half awakened by the noisy entrance of a newcomer. This was an antic fellow, half pedlar and half mountebank, who travelled about the country on foot to vend hones, strops, razors, wash-balls, harness paste, medicine for dogs and horses, cheap perfumery, cosmetics, and such-like wares, which he carried in a case slung to his back. His entrance was the signal for various homely jokes with the countrymen, which slackened not until he had made his supper and opened his box of treasures, when he ingeniously contrived to unite business with amusement. "And what be that stuff? Good to eat, Harry?" asked the grinning countryman, pointing to some composition cakes in one corner. "This," said the fellow, producing one, "this is the infallible and invaluable composition for removing all sorts of stain, rust, dirt, mildew, spick, speck, spot, or spatter, from silk, satin, linen, cambric, cloth, crape, stuff, carpet, merino, muslin, bombazine, or woollen stuff. Wine stains, fruit stains, beer stains, water stains, paint stains, pitch stains, any stains, all come out at one rub with the infallible and invaluable composition. If a lady stains her honour, she has only needs to swallow one cake, and she's cured at once, for it's poison.
If a gentleman wants to prove this, he has only need to bolt one little square, and he has put it beyond question, for it is quite as satisfactory as a pistol bullet, and a great deal nastier in the flavour, consequently the more credit in taking it. 1 penny a square. With all these virtues, 1 penny a square. There were two buyers directly, and more of the listeners plainly hesitated. The vendor, observing this, increased his loquacity. "It's all bought up as fast as it can be made," said the fellow. "There are 14 water-mills, 6 steam-engines, and a galvanic battery always a-working upon it. And they can't make it fast enough, though the men work so hard that they die off, and the widows is pensioned directly, with £20 a year for each of the children, and a premium of 50 for twins. 1 penny a square. 2 halfpence is all the same, and 4 farthings is received with joy. 1 penny a square. Wine stains, fruit stains, beer stains, water stains, paint stains, pitch stains, mud stains, blood stains. Here's a stain upon the hat of a gentleman in company that I'll take clean out before he can order me a pint of ale." "Oi!" cried Sikes, starting up. "Give that back." "I'll take it clean out, sir," replied the man, winking to the company, "before you can come across the room and get it. Gentlemen all, observe the dark stain upon this gentleman's hat, no wider than a shilling, but thicker than a half-crown. Whether it's a wine stain, fruit stain, beer stain, water stain, paint stain, pitch stain, mud stain, or blood stain—" The man got no further, for Sikes, with a hideous imprecation, overthrew the table, and tearing the hat from him, burst out of the house. With the same perversity of feeling and irresolution that had fastened upon him despite himself all day, the murderer, finding that he was not followed, and that they most probably considered him some drunken sullen fellow, turned back up the town, and getting out of the glare of the lamps of a stage-coach that was standing in the street, was walking past when he recognized the mail from London, and saw that it was standing at the little post-office. He almost knew what was to come, but he crossed over and listened. The guard was standing at the door waiting for the letter-bag. A man, dressed like a gamekeeper, came up at that moment, and he handed him a basket which lay ready on the pavement. "That's for your people," said the guard. "Now, look alive in there, will you? Damn that 'ere bag, it weren't ready night afore last. This won't do, you know." "Anything new up in town, Ben?" asked the gamekeeper, drawing back to the window-shutters, the better to admire the horses. No, nothing that I knows on," replied the man, pulling on his gloves. "Corn's up a little. I hear talk of a murder, too, down Spitalfields way, but I don't reckon much upon it." "Oh, that's quite true," said a gentleman inside, who was looking out of the window, "and a dreadful murder it was." "Was it, sir?" rejoined the guard, touching his hat. "Man or woman, pray, sir?" "A woman," replied the gentleman. "It is supposed—" "Now, Ben," replied the coachman impatiently. "Damn that 'ere bag," said the guard. "Are you going to sleep in there?" "Coming," cried the office-keeper, running out. "Coming?" growled the guard. "Ah, and so's the young woman of property that's going to take a fancy to me, but I don't know when. Here, give hold. All right!" The horn sounded a few cheerful notes, and the coach was gone. Sikes remained standing in the street, apparently unmoved by what he had just heard, and agitated by no stronger feeling than a doubt where to go. At length he went back again, and took the road which leads from Hatfield to St. Albans. He went on doggedly, but as he left the town behind him, and plunged into the solitude and darkness of the road, he felt a dread and awe creeping upon him which shook him to the core. Every object before him, substance or shadow, still or moving, took the semblance of some fearful thing. But these fears were nothing compared to the sense that haunted him of that morning's ghastly figure following at his heels. He could trace its shadow in the gloom, supply the smallest item of the outline, and note how stiff and solemn it seemed to stalk along. He could hear its garments rustling in the leaves, and every breath of wind came laden with that last low cry. If he stopped, it did the same. If he ran, it followed, not running too, that would have been a relief, but like a corpse endowed with the mere machinery of life, and borne on one slow melancholy wind that never rose or fell. At times he turned with desperate determination, resolved to beat this phantom off, though it should look him dead, but the hair rose on his head, and his blood stood still, for it had turned with him, and was behind him then. He had kept it before him that morning, but it was behind him now always. He leaned his back against the bank, and felt that it stood above him, visibly out against the cold night sky. He threw himself upon the road, on his back upon the road. At his head it stood silent, erect, and still, a living gravestone, with its epitaph in blood. Let no man talk of murderers escaping justice, and hint that Providence must sleep. There were 20 score of violent deaths in one long minute of that agony of fear. There was a shed in a field he passed, that offered shelter for the night. Before the door were 3 tall poplar trees, which made it very dark within, and the wind moaned through them with a dismal wail. He could not walk on till daylight came again, and here he stretched himself close to the wall to undergo new torture. For now a vision came before him, as constant and more terrible than that from which he had escaped. Those widely staring eyes, so lustreless and so glassy that he had better borne to see them than to think upon them, appeared in the midst of the darkness, light in themselves, but giving light to nothing. They were but two, but they were everywhere. If he shut out the sight, there came the room with every well-known object, some indeed that he would have forgotten if he had gone over its contents from memory, each in its accustomed place. The body was in its place, and its eyes were as he saw them when he stole away. He got up and rushed into the field without. The figure was behind him. He re-entered the shed and shrunk down once more. The eyes were there before he had laid himself along. And there he remained in such terror as none but he can know, trembling in every limb, and the cold sweat starting from every pore, when suddenly there arose upon the night wind a noise of distant shouting, and the roar of voices mingling in alarm and wonder. Any sound of men in that lonely place, even though it conveyed a real cause of alarm, was something to him. He regained his strength and energy at the prospect of personal danger, and springing to his feet, rushed into the open air. The broad sky seemed on fire. Rising into the air with showers of sparks, and rolling one above the other, were sheets of flame lighting the atmosphere for miles round, and driving clouds of smoke in the direction where he stood. The shouts grew louder as new voices swelled the roar, and he could hear the cry of "Fire!" mingled with the ringing of an alarm bell, the fall of heavy bodies, and the crackling of flames as they twined round some new obstacle, and shot aloft as though refreshed by food. The noise increased as he looked. There were people there, men and women, light, bustle. It was like new life to him. He darted onward, straight headlong, dashing through briar and brake, and leaping gate and fence as madly as a dog, who careered with loud and sounding bark before him. He came upon the spot. There were half-dressed figures tearing to and fro, some endeavouring to drag the frightened horses from the stables, others driving the cattle from the yard and outhouses, and others coming laden from the burning pile, amidst the shower of falling sparks and the tumbling down of red-hot beams. The apertures, where doors and windows stood an hour ago, disclosed a mass of raging fire. Walls rocked and crumbled into the burning well. The molten lead and iron poured down white-hot upon the ground. Women and children shrieked, and men encouraged each other with noisy shouts and cheers. The clanking of the engine pumps and the spurting and hissing of the water as it fell upon the blazing wood added to the tremendous roar. He shouted too, till he was hoarse, and flying from memory and himself, plunged into the thickest of the throng. Hither and thither he dived that night, now working at the pumps, and now hurrying through the smoke and flame, but never ceasing to engage himself wherever noise and men were thickest. Up and down the ladders, upon the roofs of the buildings, over floors that quaked and trembled with his weight, under the lee of falling bricks and stones, in every part of that great fire was he. But he bore a charmed life, and had neither scratch nor bruise nor weariness nor thought, till morning dawned again, and only smoke and blackened ruins remained. This mad excitement over, there returned with tenfold force the dreadful consciousness of his crime. He looked suspiciously about him, for the men were conversing in groups, and he feared to be the subject of their talk. The dog obeyed the significant beck of his finger, and they drew off stealthily together. He passed near an engine where some men were seated, and they called him to share in their refreshment. He took some bread and meat, and as he drank a draught of beer, heard the firemen, who were from London, talking about the murder. "He has gone to Birmingham, they say," said one, "but they'll have him yet, for the scouts are out, and by to–morrow night there'll be a cry all through the country." He hurried off and walked till he almost dropped upon the ground, then lay down in a lane and had a long but broken and uneasy sleep. He wandered on again, irresolute and undecided, and oppressed with the fear of another solitary night. Suddenly he took the desperate resolution of going back to London. "There's somebody to speak to there, at all event," he thought. "A good hiding place, too. They'll never expect to nab me there after this country's scent. Why can't I lie by for a week or so, and, forcing blunt from Fagin, get abroad to France? Damn, I'll risk it." He acted upon this impulse without delay, and choosing the least frequented roads, began his journey back, resolved to lie concealed within a short distance of the metropolis, and entering it at dusk by a circuitous route, to proceed straight to that part of it which he had fixed on for his destination. The dog, though, if any description of him were out, it would not be forgotten that the dog was missing, and had probably gone with him. This might lead to his apprehension as he passed along the streets. He resolved to drown him, and walked on, looking about for a pond, picking up a heavy stone and tying it to his handkerchief as he went. The animal looked up into his master's face while these preparations were making. Whether his instinct apprehended something of their purpose, or the robber's sidelong look at him was sterner than ordinary, he skulked a little farther in the rear than usual, and cowered as he came more slowly along. When his master halted at the brink of a pool, and looked round to call him, he stopped outright. "Do you hear me, Cole? Come here," cried Sikes. The animal came up from the very force of habit, but as Sikes stooped to attach the handkerchief to his throat, he uttered a low growl and started back. "Come back," said the robber. The dog wagged his tail but moved not. Sikes made a running noose and called him again. The dog advanced, retreated, paused an instant, and scoured away at his hardest speed. The man whistled again and again, and sat down and waited in the expectation that he would return, but no dog appeared, and at length he resumed his journey.